The maid of a luxury hotel was accused of stealing a valuable watch. When the millionaire saw her hand trembling, he recognized the scar of the doctor who saved his life 30 years ago. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Belvedere Hotel's presidential suite, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Elizabeth Miller moved methodically through the room, her 75-year-old hands working with practiced efficiency, despite the arthritis that had settled into her joints years ago. There was something dignified about the way she carried herself, back straight, chin slightly lifted, that seemed at odds with her maid's uniform. "Mrs. Miller, you're needed on the 14th floor when you finish here," called a voice from the doorway. Thomas Wilson, the hotel manager, stood there with his perpetual frown, clipboard in hand. "And make sure this suite is absolutely perfect. The new owner is arriving today." Elizabeth nodded without looking up. "Yes, Mr. Wilson. I'll see to it." As Wilson's footsteps faded down the hallway, Elizabeth allowed herself a small sigh. Rumors had been swirling through the staff for weeks about the Belvedere's new ownership. Anderson Hotels, one of the largest luxury hotel chains in the world, had acquired the property, and the CEO himself was coming to inspect his new acquisition, Anderson. The name still caused a tightness in her chest. Even after all these years, she moved to the bedroom, carefully making the king-sized bed with hospital corners, a habit from another life. As she smoothed the Egyptian cotton sheets, her sleeve rode up, revealing a distinctive half-moon scar on her right hand. Elizabeth paused, running her thumb over the raised tissue. 30 years had passed, but the memory remained as fresh as the day it happened. The squeal of tires on wet pavement, the frantic beeping of hospital monitors, the slick feel of blood on her hands as she worked desperately to save a life. The sound of housekeeping carts and voices in the hallway pulled her back to the present. She had a job to finish, across town, in the sleek midtown offices of Anderson Hotels. Robert Anderson stood at the window of his corner office, watching the Manhattan skyline with an absent expression. At 55, he cut an imposing figure, tall, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes the color of weathered steel. The Wall Street Journal had once called him ruthlessly efficient, a description he privately felt was fair. He'd built his father's modest hotel chain into an international empire through strategic acquisitions and an unflinching business sense. Yet success had never quite filled the nameless emptiness he'd carried since childhood. Robert's hand instinctively went to his neck, fingers finding the St. Luke medal he'd worn since before he could remember. His adoptive mother had told him it was a gift from his birth mother, the only thing she'd left him with. He never took it off, though he couldn't explain why it mattered so much. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Anderson, Daniel Carter is here." "Send him in." Daniel Carter entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. At 50, he was trim and distinguished, with a carefully trimmed beard and calculating eyes that missed nothing. "Robert," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "the Belvedere acquisition files are complete. I've reviewed everything personally." "Good." Robert gestured to a chair. "And the staff transitions. Minimal disruptions. We're keeping most of the current employees. It's part of the Belvedere's charm. The older staff especially gives it that old-world service feel that guests pay a premium for." Robert nodded. He'd built his reputation on preserving what made each property unique while modernizing operations. "And you'll be overseeing the transition personally?" "Absolutely." Daniel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've waited a long time for this opportunity." What Robert couldn't know was the double meaning behind those words. For Daniel Carter was not who he claimed to be. Behind the expensive suit and polished credentials was Michael Miller, the son Elizabeth had pushed away 30 years ago. He'd spent years methodically working his way into Anderson Hotels, changing his name, his appearance, even his accent, all to get close to the man and the family he believed had destroyed his mother's life. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth was finishing her shift when a commotion near the lobby caught her attention. A procession of black SUVs had pulled up to the entrance, and staff were scurrying to attention. "It's him," whispered Marta, another housekeeper. "The new boss." Elizabeth should have turned away, should have headed to the service elevator and gone home. Instead, something compelled her to move toward the lobby, keeping to the periphery where guests rarely looked. Through the crowd, she caught her first glimpse of Robert Anderson in 30 years. The boy she'd last seen unconscious on an operating table was now a commanding presence, shaking hands with the hotel management team. His face had matured into sharper angles. But those eyes, those were undeniably William's eyes. Elizabeth felt her heart constrict. She pressed her scarred hand against the wall to steady herself. Then Robert turned, surveying the grand lobby with a proprietor's gaze, and for a brief moment, their eyes met across the expanse of marble and crystal chandeliers. Something flickered across his face. Confusion, perhaps, or déjà vu. Before Thomas Wilson recaptured his attention, Elizabeth slipped away, unaware that her life was about to unravel once more. In the presidential suite that evening, Robert unpacked his personal items with methodical precision. The vintage Patek Philippe watch, his adoptive father's prized possession, was placed carefully on the nightstand alongside his St. Luke medal. As he showered away the travel fatigue, the recurring nightmare returned in flashes. Rain-slicked roads, shattering glass, a woman's face blurred behind surgical mask, bloodied hands working with desperate precision, a distinctive half-moon scar. He'd had this dream since the accident that nearly claimed his life 30 years ago. But lately, it had been coming more frequently. Unknown to Robert, Jennifer Anderson, his son's wife and his daughter-in-law, was slipping into his suite using a stolen master key. Her elegant appearance concealed mounting gambling debts and the desperation they'd bred. Her eyes landed on the antique watch, its value well into the millions, a quick solution to her immediate problems. With manicured fingers, she slipped the timepiece into her purse, careful not to disturb anything else. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of a housekeeper's cart outside in the hallway and quickened her pace. The last thing she needed was a witness. Meanwhile, in his temporary office downstairs, Daniel Carter stared at an old photograph hidden in a false compartment of his wallet. A much younger Elizabeth smiled back at him, her arms around a teenage boy. He ran his thumb over her face, hatred and love battling within him. "Soon, Mom," he whispered. "Soon, they'll pay for what they did to you." 3 decades of carefully orchestrated vengeance was finally coming to fruition, and nothing would stop him now. Morning sunlight had barely begun to filter through the floor-to-ceiling curtains of the presidential suite when Robert Anderson realized something was wrong. His morning routine never varied. Shower, shave, check emails, then secure his father's Patek Philippe watch and St. Luke medal before heading out. The medal hung where he'd left it, but the watch was gone. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his still damp hair. He methodically searched every surface, checking pockets and bags, growing increasingly frustrated. The watch wasn't just valuable, it was irreplaceable, the last gift from his adoptive father before his death. He picked up the phone. Security now. Within minutes, Thomas Wilson was at his door, face already beaded with sweat despite the early hour. "Mr. Anderson, I cannot express how deeply disturbed I am by this situation," Wilson said, his voice strained with barely contained panic. "Nothing like this has ever happened at the Belvedere. I assure you we'll recover your property immediately." "I don't want assurances, Wilson. I want results." Robert's voice was calm but carried an edge that made the manager flinch. "Who had access to my suite yesterday?" Wilson pulled out a tablet, fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through staff logs. "Just the housekeeping staff, sir. Specifically, Mrs. Miller was assigned to your suite. Get her up here now." Downstairs in the employee locker room, Elizabeth was just beginning her shift, tying back her silver hair and securing her name badge when Wilson burst in, face flushed. "Miller, with me now." His tone drew the attention of every employee in the room. "What's happened?" Elizabeth asked, straightening her uniform. "Just come, Mr. Anderson wants to see you." The walk to the elevator and the ride up to the presidential suite was silent and tense. Elizabeth felt a growing sense of dread. Had Robert somehow recognized her? Had he made the connection? When they entered the suite, Robert was standing by the window, phone in hand. He turned, his gaze intense and searching as it settled on Elizabeth. "Mrs. Miller, is it?" His eyes narrowed slightly, narrowed. "You cleaned this suite yesterday?" "Yes, sir." Elizabeth kept her voice steady, professional. "My watch is missing. A Patek Philippe, extremely valuable, both monetarily and personally." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "Sir, I assure you—" "Save it," Wilson interrupted. "Mr. Anderson, with your permission, I'd like security to conduct a thorough search." Robert studied Elizabeth's face carefully. There was something familiar about her that he couldn't place. something in the dignified way she held herself despite her obvious distress. "Proceed," he said finally. What followed was a humiliation Elizabeth had never imagined enduring. Wilson insisted the search be conducted in the hotel's main lobby during the morning rush, making a spectacle that would serve as a deterrent to other employees. Security emptied her pockets, searched her purse, and patted her down while guests and co-workers looked on. "Open your hands!" Wilson commanded, his voice carrying across the now silent lobby. Both sides. Elizabeth slowly extended her hands, palms up, then down, as she turned her right hand. Robert, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward suddenly. His eyes were fixed on the distinctive half-moon scar across her palm. "That scar," he said, his voice barely audible. "How did you get it?" Before Elizabeth could answer, Wilson interrupted. "Sir, she's clean. Perhaps we should check the other staff." But Robert wasn't listening. A flash of memory. Surgical lights, bloody surgical gloves, hands working frantically, a woman's voice calling for more sutures, hit him with unexpected force. He'd seen that scar before, in his recurring nightmare. "Mr. Anderson." Wilson's voice broke through his thoughts. Robert shook his head slightly. "Continue the investigation, check the surveillance footage, and Mrs. Miller," he hesitated, "you're free to go for now." From across the lobby, Jennifer Anderson watched the scene unfold with calculated concern on her perfectly made-up face. She'd come down for breakfast when the commotion began, and now she approached her father-in-law with practiced sympathy. "Robert, how awful. Was it the watch Uncle James left you?" She touched his arm lightly. "David will be devastated to hear about this. He always admired that piece." Robert nodded absently, his eyes still following Elizabeth as she walked stiffly toward the service area, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. "Yes, it's unfortunate," he said finally. "Jennifer, have you seen David this morning? He had an early breakfast meeting." "Investment thing." She waved a hand dismissively. "You know David, always working. I'm actually meeting my decorator later about the apartment renovations, since you're generously funding them. Perhaps you'd like to join us." Her smile was dazzling but didn't reach her eyes. "Another time. I have meetings with the transition team today." Robert turned to Wilson. "I want to know more about that housekeeper, her employment history, background, everything." Wilson nodded eagerly. "Of course, sir. I'll have a complete report by this afternoon." In the employee break room, Elizabeth sank onto a plastic chair, her hands trembling slightly. After decades of careful anonymity, to be publicly accused and to have Robert's attention focused directly on her, it was everything she'd feared. "You okay, Liz?" Marta placed a steaming cup of tea in front of her. "That Wilson? He's a real piece of work. We all know you didn't take nothing." "Thank you, Marta." Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the warm mug, trying to still their shaking. "That scar." Marta nodded toward Elizabeth's right hand. The new boss seemed real interested in it. Elizabeth instinctively covered her right hand with her left. Old injury, from another lifetime. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter sat in his temporary office, watching security footage of the lobby incident on his tablet. Seeing his mother publicly humiliated sent a wave of rage through him so intense he had to set the device down. 30 years of carefully cultivated control nearly shattered in an instant. "Everything okay in here?" Jennifer appeared in his doorway without knocking, closing the door behind her. Daniel quickly composed his features. "Mrs. Anderson, what can I do for you?" "Please, it's Jennifer," she said, crossing to his desk with feline grace. "And maybe the question is what I can do for you." She perched on the edge of his desk, her designer dress riding up slightly. "I couldn't help but notice your reaction to the scene in the lobby. That housekeeper means something to you, doesn't she?" Daniel's face betrayed nothing. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jennifer laughed softly. "Come now, Mr. Carter. We're both adults playing complicated games. I took Robert's watch, and you're not who you claim to be." She held up a hand when he started to protest. "Don't bother denying it. The question is, what do we do with our mutual interests? You're admitting to theft. I'm suggesting a partnership." Jennifer leaned closer. "You have some vendetta against the Andersons. I don't care why. I have financial problems that need solving. Together, we might help each other." Before Daniel could respond, His phone chimed with a text. It was from an anonymous contact he paid handsomely for information. A. Miller discharged from Columbia Presbyterian 30 years ago. Same night as R. Anderson accident. Connection confirmed. He looked up at Jennifer with new calculation in his eyes. Tell me more about this partnership. That evening, Robert sat alone in his suite. The day's meetings concluded. Wilson's report on Elizabeth Miller sat open on his tablet, a sparse document that raised more questions than it answered. 65 when hired at the Belvedere. Exemplary work record. Lived alone in a modest apartment in Queens. No criminal history. No remarkable financials. Nothing to suggest motive for theft. But before that, almost nothing. As if Elizabeth Miller barely existed before age 45, Robert's fingers found the St. Luke medal at his neck. A habit whenever he was deep in thought. The scar on the housekeeper's hand haunted him. It matched exactly the one from his dreams. Dreams about the night that nearly ended his life 30 years ago. He pulled up an old news article on his tablet. Heir to hotel fortune in critical condition after hit and run. The details were sparse. He'd been found unconscious on a rain-soaked road, his car demolished. The other driver had fled the scene. He'd spent weeks in the hospital, much of it unconscious. His adoptive father had always discouraged questions about the accident, about his birth parents, about anything before he came to live with the Andersons. The past is the past, son, James would say. Focus on the future you'll build. But now, with that distinctive scar triggering memories he couldn't fully grasp, Robert felt compelled to dig deeper. He pulled up the hospital records his private investigator had obtained years ago. The surgeon who'd saved his life that night, the one who'd worked 12 hours straight when others said he couldn't be saved, was listed simply as Dr. E. Miller. Robert's breath caught. Could it be possible? Elizabeth Miller, Dr. A. Miller. He reached for his phone to call security, to have them bring Elizabeth to him immediately, but stopped himself. If she was the surgeon who saved him, why was she working as a hotel maid? And why did she seem afraid when she saw him? No, this required a more delicate approach. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to speak with Elizabeth Miller privately. After all these years, he deserved answers. What Robert couldn't know was that across town, in her small apartment, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table staring at an old wooden box she rarely opened. Inside lay newspaper clippings. Photographs and mementos of a life abandoned, her medical license, a faded photograph of a teenage Michael, and hidden in a secret compartment, a birth certificate for a baby boy born to Elizabeth Miller and William Anderson, a baby given up for adoption to James Anderson and his wife. Elizabeth touched the birth certificate gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room. "I never meant for any of this to happen." The storm clouds gathering over Manhattan that night seemed to mirror the darkness closing in around all of them. A darkness 30 years in the making, finally ready to break. The morning brought no relief to Elizabeth's anxiety. Sleep had eluded her, memories surfacing like bodies in a flood. William's smile, the weight of a newborn Robert in her arms for those brief, precious moments before they took him away. Michael's face contorted with betrayal the night she told him to leave the country and never return. She'd spent the early hours replacing everything in the wooden box, securing it in its hiding place behind the loose baseboard in her bedroom. If Robert was starting to make connections, she needed to be prepared for every possibility. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The Belvedere's number. With trembling fingers, she answered. "Mrs. Miller, this is Thomas Wilson." His voice dripped with artificial politeness. "We need you to come in early today, mister. Anderson has requested your presence." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs. "May I ask why?" "It's not my place to question Mr. Anderson's requests," Wilson replied stiffly. "Be here in an hour." After hanging up, Elizabeth sat motionless at her kitchen table. She'd spent 30 years carefully constructing walls between her past and present. Now those walls were crumbling and she had no idea how to stop it. Across town, Robert paced his suite, coffee cooling untouched on the desk. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with questions. The connection seemed impossible yet undeniable. Could the dignified housekeeper with the half-moon scar really be the brilliant surgeon who saved his life? And if so, why was she now cleaning hotel rooms instead of performing life-saving surgeries? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Jennifer entered, immaculately dressed despite the early hour. "Robert, You look terrible, didn't you sleep? I had things on my mind. He gestured vaguely at the papers spread across the desk. What brings you here so early? Jennifer settled gracefully into an armchair. David's worried about you. This missing watch has you obsessed. She tilted her head slightly. Speaking of which, any progress? Nothing yet. Robert studied his daughter-in-law carefully. Always perfectly poised. Always saying the right things. Yet something about Jennifer had never quite rung true to him. Where is David this morning? Tokyo call, those international time zones. She sighed dramatically. Robert, I wanted to mention something about yesterday. That housekeeper. Miller, was it? The way she looked at you. Jennifer leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. It was strange, like she knew you. Robert's expression remained neutral, but his interest sharpened. What do you mean? Just a feeling. Women's intuition? Jennifer shrugged delicately. Maybe check if there's some connection you're not aware of. In my experience, people don't look at strangers that way unless there's history. I'll keep that in mind, Robert replied, wondering what Jennifer's real angle might be. If you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to prepare for. After Jennifer left, Robert turned to the window, watching rain begin to speckle the glass. The weather forecast had predicted storms all week, much like that night 30 years ago when his life had nearly ended, and perhaps had actually begun again at the hands of a surgeon named E. Miller, in the Belvedere's executive offices, Daniel Carter was reviewing financial documents when his secure phone vibrated with a text. Found employee records from Columbia Presbyterian. E.M. resigned abruptly 30 years ago, cited personal reasons, no formal complaints, but rumors of ethical breach. The message was followed by a scanned resignation letter bearing his mother's signature. Daniel stared at the screen, his carefully constructed narrative beginning to develop cracks. He'd spent decades believing the Andersons had somehow forced his mother out of medicine, ruined her career as punishment for some unknown transgression. But if she had resigned voluntarily, he pushed the thought away. The Andersons had destroyed his family one way or another. His mother had been one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the country, and then suddenly she wasn't. Just as Robert Anderson miraculously recovered from what should have been a fatal accident, it couldn't be coincidence. A knock at his door preceded Wilson's head poking in. Mr. Carter, Mr. Anderson asked me to inform you that the staff meeting has been moved to noon. Something's come up. Thank you, Wilson. Daniel waited until the door closed before pulling up the hotel's staff schedule on his tablet. His mother was due to work the executive floors today, including Robert's suite. Whatever was coming up likely involved her. Elizabeth arrived at the Belvedere through the employee entrance, keeping her head down as she passed colleagues. Word of yesterday's public accusation had spread, and she felt the weight of curious stares. She changed quickly into her uniform and headed to the service elevator, only to be intercepted by Wilson. This way, Mrs. Miller. He gestured toward the main elevator bank. Mr. Anderson is waiting in his office. The executive floor was quiet, most offices still empty this early. Wilson led her to the end of the hallway where temporary brass lettering marked Robert's office. He knocked once, then opened the door. Mrs. Miller, as requested, sir. Robert stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the stormy sky. Thank you, Wilson. That will be all. Wilson hesitated. Sir, given the circumstances, perhaps I should... That will be all, Robert repeated firmly, turning to face them. His eyes met Elizabeth's, and for a moment, she saw William and his features so clearly it took her breath away. When the door closed behind Wilson, silence filled the room. Elizabeth stood with her hands clasped in front of her, outwardly calm despite her racing heart. Please, sit. Robert gestured to a chair across from his desk. I prefer to stand, if that's all right, Mr. Anderson. A slight smile touched his lips. Strong-willed, just like in Wilson's report. He moved to his desk, but remained standing. Mrs. Miller, I owe you an apology for yesterday's public spectacle. It was unprofessional and unnecessary. Elizabeth hadn't expected that. Thank you, sir. Robert leaned against his desk, studying her face. I have questions, and I think you have answers. About your watch, she asked cautiously. About your scar. He nodded toward her right hand. May I see it again? Slowly. Elizabeth extended her hand, palm up. The half-moon scar curved across her palm, faded with age but still distinct. Robert stepped closer, examining it. How did you get this? Elizabeth had prepared for this question. Kitchen accident, many years ago. I don't believe you. His voice was soft but firm. I've seen that scar before. In dreams I've had since my accident 30 years ago. The surgeon who saved me had that exact scar. Elizabeth's breath caught. Mr. Anderson, were you a doctor, Mrs. Miller? When she didn't answer, he pressed on. I pulled my medical records. The surgeon who operated on me for 12 hours straight was listed as Dr. A. Miller. Elizabeth Miller. Rain began to hit the windows harder, providing a rhythmic backdrop to the tension in the room. Elizabeth felt cornered, decades of careful secrecy crumbling around her. It was a long time ago, she finally said, her voice barely audible. So it is true. Robert's expression shifted between disbelief and wonder. You were the surgeon who saved my life, and now you're cleaning my hotel room. Why? Before Elizabeth could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, the door opened and Daniel walked in, stopping short when he saw his mother. I apologize for interrupting, he said smoothly, though his eyes betrayed his shock. Wilson mentioned the staff meeting was delayed. I didn't realize you were in a private meeting. Carter? Robert straightened. This is Mrs. Miller. We were just discussing some historical matters. Elizabeth's face had gone pale at the sight of her son, her Michael, now calling himself Daniel Carter. She hadn't seen him in 30 years, not since that rainy night when she'd made him promise to start a new life far away. Now here he was, working alongside Robert, the half-brother he didn't know existed. Mrs. Miller and I will continue our conversation later, Robert said, sensing her discomfort. That will be all for now, Mrs. Miller. Elizabeth nodded stiffly and turned to leave, careful not to make eye contact with Daniel as she passed him. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. Once the door closed behind her, Daniel turned to Robert. What was that about? Just following up on the watch investigation. Robert's tone made it clear the subject was closed. Now about the Belvedere financials. As Elizabeth rode the service elevator down, she leaned against the wall, legs weak. Michael, her Michael, was here, using a different name, working directly with Robert. It couldn't be coincidence somehow. He had discovered a connection to the Andersons and had orchestrated this entire situation. The implications terrified her. Michael had always been brilliant but volatile, especially after learning he was adopted as a toddler. The night of the accident, he'd been drinking heavily, devastated by divorce papers from his wife and the discovery of adoption paperwork he'd found while clearing out Elizabeth's old study. She'd never told him about Robert, about his half-brother, about any of it. And now her two sons, one who knew nothing of their connection, and one who likely suspected but didn't know the whole truth, were circling each other like predators, with Elizabeth caught between them. In his office, Daniel closed the door and immediately pulled out his secure phone. Messaging his contact, "Need everything on Elizabeth Miller's history with Columbia Presbyterian and the Andersons. Urgent." The response came almost immediately. "Already working on it, but heads up. Someone else is digging too. Same information, different channels." Daniel frowned. Robert was investigating his mother. Just as she seemed to be hiding something from both of them, whatever secrets Elizabeth Miller had buried 30 years ago were about to come to light. Ready or not, that evening, Jennifer slipped into Daniel's office after hours, locking the door behind her. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "Robert's digging into the housekeeper's past." Daniel looked up from his computer. "I know. You don't understand." Jennifer paced the small office. "If he connects her to that night, he might start looking at the accident more closely. There are police reports, witness statements that were buried." "By whom?" Daniel interrupted sharply. Jennifer stopped pacing. "The Andersons have been burying inconvenient truths for generations. Trust me, I married into enough of their secrets to know." She leaned across his desk. "What's your interest in Elizabeth Miller? And don't bother lying. I saw your face when she was in Robert's office today." For a long moment, Daniel weighed his options. Finally, he said, "She's my mother." Jennifer's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Well, that is interesting." She smiled slowly. "I think our partnership just got a lot more valuable to both of us." Outside, thunder rumbled as the storm intensified, echoing the turbulence building within the walls of the Belvedere Hotel. A storm 30 years in the making, finally ready to break over all their heads. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she made the bed in suite 1422, her mind far from the crisp corners and plumped pillows that had been second nature for 15 years. The storm that had threatened all morning had finally broken. Rain lashing against the windows like nature itself was trying to warn her. Michael was here. Her son. The boy she'd raised alone after his father died. The teenager who'd discovered his adoption papers on that fateful night 30 years ago. The young man she'd forced to leave the country with a new identity after the accident. Was now calling himself Daniel Carter and working directly with Robert. Her other son, his half-brother, Mrs. Miller. A voice startled her from her thoughts. She turned to find Marta in the doorway. "You okay? You've been making that same bed for 20 minutes. Elizabeth forced a smile. "Just a bit tired today." "Well, take it easy. You're pale as a ghost." Marta's concerned eyes lingered on her. "And don't let what happened yesterday get to you. Nobody believes you took that watch." "Thank you, Marta." After her colleague left, Elizabeth sat heavily on the edge of the freshly made bed, pressing her scarred hand to her chest, where a dull ache had been building all morning. The medication was in her purse in the staff room. But the thought of walking all the way there suddenly seemed overwhelming. Just a moment's rest, she told herself, closing her eyes against a wave of dizziness. Images flashed behind her closed lids. William's face when she told him she was pregnant. The cold eyes of his father as he handed her a check and took her baby. Michael's high school graduation where she'd sat alone. So proud, yet so aware of the empty chair where Robert should have been. The operating room 30 years ago. Blood on her hands. Michael's victim. Her firstborn son. As she fought death itself for 12 desperate hours. The room tilted sideways. Elizabeth tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The last thing she heard was the crash of her own body hitting the floor, and a distant voice calling her name. Downstairs in the executive offices, Robert was reviewing renovation plans when Wilson burst in without knocking. "Mr. Anderson, there's been an incident. The housekeeper, Mrs. Miller, has collapsed. The paramedics are on their way." Robert was on his feet instantly. "Where?" "14th floor, sir, but..." Robert was already moving past him, heading for the stairs rather than waiting for the elevator. He took them two at a time. An urgency he couldn't explain driving him forward. By the time he reached the 14th floor, a small crowd had gathered outside room 1422. He pushed through to find Elizabeth on the floor, pale and unresponsive, a young housekeeper kneeling beside her. "She just fell, sir," the girl explained, tears in her eyes. "1 minute she was making the bed, then..." Robert knelt beside Elizabeth, taking her wrist to check her pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Without thinking, he placed his hand over her heart, feeling for the rhythm the way someone with medical training might. "Has she had heart problems before?" he asked sharply. The housekeeper shook her head. "I don't know, sir. She keeps to herself." The distant wail of sirens penetrated the hotel's thick walls. Robert looked down at Elizabeth's face, lined with age yet still holding echoes of a beauty that must have been striking in her youth. There was something hauntingly familiar in the curve of her cheekbone, the shape of her brow. When the paramedics arrived, Robert stepped back to let them work, but found himself saying, "I'm coming with her." "Are you family, sir?" asked one of the paramedics. The question hit him like a physical blow. "No, but I'm responsible for her. She works for me." "Robert." Daniel appeared at his elbow. Having been alerted to the situation, "Let me handle this. You have the meeting with the investors in 30 minutes. Reschedule it," Robert replied, without taking his eyes off Elizabeth, as the paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher. "This is more important." Daniel's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "You don't even know this woman." Something in his tone made Robert glance at him sharply. "What's your interest in the situation, Carter? Just trying to keep the company running while you attend to other matters." Daniel's expression was carefully blank, but tension radiated from him. Robert studied him for a moment, then turned away. "I'll be at Columbia Presbyterian if anyone needs me." As the paramedics wheeled Elizabeth toward the service elevator, Robert followed, leaving Daniel standing rigidly among the whispering housekeeping staff. Once they were gone, Daniel pulled out his phone and sent a terse message. "EM, hospitalized at Columbia Presbyterian, RA, accompanying her. Need eyes there ASAP." The response came seconds later. "On it." What about her apartment? Daniel hesitated only a moment before typing, "Get me in, tonight." Across town, Columbia Presbyterian Hospital hadn't changed much in the 30 years since Elizabeth had last walked its halls as doctor. Miller, the same antiseptic smell, the same fluorescent lighting, the same controlled chaos. Only now she was the patient, not the doctor giving orders. Robert sat in the waiting room, his presence causing a stir among the hospital staff. It wasn't every day a billionaire CEO camped out in their emergency department. He'd already called Elizabeth's emergency contact, a former nurse named Margaret Jenkins, who'd promised to come right away, and instructed his assistant to send flowers to Elizabeth's room once she was assigned one. "Mr. Anderson," a middle-aged doctor approached him. "I'm Dr. Patterson. I understand you came in with Elizabeth Miller." Robert stood. "Yes. How is she?" "Stable for now. She's had a cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, but concerning given her age and medical history." The doctor hesitated. "Are you family?" That question again. "No, she works for me, but I'd like to see her if possible." Dr. Patterson seemed about to refuse. Then recognition dawned in his eyes. "Wait, Anderson, as in the Anderson wing of cardiology." Robert nodded. His family had donated generously to the hospital over the years, particularly to cardiac research. "That's right. Well, I suppose we can make an exception." The doctor gestured for Robert to follow him. "She's sedated but stable. We're going to keep her for observation and run some tests." They walked down a corridor to a small private room where Elizabeth lay connected to monitors, an IV in her arm. She looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way that stirred something protective in Robert. "I'll give you a few minutes, Doctor," Patterson said, leaving them alone. Robert moved to Elizabeth's bedside, studying her face in repose. The nagging sense of familiarity intensified. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, the one with the half-moon scar. "Who are you really?" he whispered. A soft knock at the door made him turn. An elderly nurse with kind eyes and steel-gray hair stood there, concern etched on her face. "Margaret Jenkins," Robert guessed. She nodded, moving to Elizabeth's other side. "Oh, Liz," she murmured, touching her friend's cheek. "I told you to take it easy." "You've known her a long time?" Robert asked. Margaret looked up, really seeing him for the first time, and something like shock passed over her face. "My goodness," she whispered. "You look just like him." "Like who?" Margaret seemed to catch herself. "I'm sorry. You reminded me of someone for a moment." She straightened. "Yes, I've known Elizabeth for over 40 years. We worked together at Columbia Presbyterian." "So she was a doctor," Robert said softly. "A surgeon." Margaret's expression grew cautious. "You know about that. I've recently discovered that Mrs. Miller was the surgeon who saved my life 30 years ago after a car accident." Robert met her gaze directly. "What I don't understand is why a brilliant surgeon ended up working as a hotel housekeeper, or why she seems afraid of me." For a long moment, Margaret was silent, clearly weighing her words carefully. "It's not my story to tell," she finally said. "But I will say this. Elizabeth has carried burdens you can't imagine. Whatever you think you know, the truth is far more complicated." Before Robert could press further, Elizabeth stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. Both of them turned their attention to her. But she didn't wake fully. "She needs rest," Margaret said firmly. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation outside." They moved to the small waiting area at the end of the hall. Rain streamed down the windows, distorting the city lights beyond. "I want to help her," Robert said once they were seated. "Something tells me our connection goes beyond that accident 30 years ago, the way she looks at me sometimes." Margaret sighed heavily. "Mr. Anderson, some secrets aren't ours to reveal. Elizabeth has made choices, difficult, painful choices, that she believed were necessary to protect those she loves, including you." "Me? Why would she need to protect me?" "That's something only Elizabeth can explain." Margaret stood, effectively ending the conversation. "I'm going to stay with her for a while. You should go home. Get some rest." But Robert had no intention of going home. After Margaret returned to Elizabeth's room, he pulled out his phone and called his most trusted private investigator. "I need everything you can find on Elizabeth Miller, former cardiac surgeon at Columbia Presbyterian. Focus on her connection to my birth family and the accident 30 years ago. And I need it fast. Across town." Elizabeth's small apartment sat dark and empty, the wooden box with its precious contents still hidden behind the baseboard. But not for long, under cover of the storm. A figure with a lock-picking set made quick work of her front door. Slipping inside with the expertise of someone well-practiced in covert entry, Daniel Carter moved through the apartment silently, methodically searching every potential hiding place. When he found the loose baseboard and the wooden box behind it, his heart raced. Inside were the remnants of his mother's former life, her medical credentials, newspaper clippings about her pioneering surgical techniques, photos of him as a child, and at the bottom, in a hidden compartment he almost missed, a birth certificate and a faded photograph that made his blood run cold. Elizabeth, much younger, cradling a newborn beside her. A man whose features were disturbingly familiar, William Anderson, and written on the back in his mother's handwriting, Robert William Anderson, born 7/14/70. Daniel sank onto the edge of the bed, the photograph trembling in his hands. The truth crashed over him like a physical blow. Robert Anderson wasn't just the son of the family that had ruined his mother's life. Robert was his half-brother. The sound of a key in the lock jolted him back to awareness. Quickly, he replaced everything except the photograph, which he slipped into his pocket before melting into the shadows of the bedroom. Jennifer Anderson stepped into the apartment, closing the door softly behind her. "Daniel," she called in a stage whisper. "Are you here?" He emerged from the bedroom, his face a mask of control despite the turmoil within. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you, I imagine." Her smile was predatory. "Looking for leverage? Did you find anything interesting?" Daniel regarded her coolly. "Nothing relevant to you. Don't be that way." She moved closer, perfume enveloping him. "We're partners, remember? And I brought you something valuable." She pulled a flash drive from her purse. Hospital security footage from the night of Robert's accident. It took some persuasion to get it. "But I think you'll find it illuminating." "How did you get this?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Let's just say I've made it my business to understand the Anderson family's secrets. It's a form of insurance in my marriage." She held out the drive. "Take it. Consider it a gesture of good faith." Daniel accepted it warily. "Why are you really helping me?" Jennifer's smile faded. "Because Robert Anderson has controlled my husband's life, and by extension mine, for too long. Because the Anderson fortune should rightfully pass to David, not be squandered on Robert's pet projects and charitable impulses, and because I need an ally who isn't afraid to do what's necessary." A crack of thunder punctuated her words, briefly illuminating the darkness between them. Daniel pocketed the flash drive, acutely aware of the photograph already there. Evidence that everything he'd believed about the Andersons, about his mother, about his own mission of vengeance, might have been built on false premises. "We should go," he said, moving toward the door. "Separately, I'll review what you've brought me and be in touch." After Jennifer left, Daniel lingered a moment longer, looking around the modest apartment his mother had called home for 15 years. On a small table by the window sat a single framed photograph, him at his high school graduation, young and smiling, his mother's arm around his shoulders, both unaware of how their lives would shatter just a few years later. His phone buzzed with a message from his contact at the hospital. "EM. Stable. RA. Still there. Something else." Old nurse recognized him, overheard her say to another nurse, "It's like seeing William Anderson's ghost." Daniel stared at the message, then at the graduation photo. The pieces were coming together into a picture he'd never imagined, one that threatened to unravel not just his plans for revenge, but his entire understanding of his family history. As he slipped out into the stormy night, Daniel knew one thing with certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. The rain had finally stopped by morning, leaving Manhattan glistening under a tentative sun. Jennifer Anderson stood at the window of her Upper East Side penthouse, coffee cooling in her hand as she mentally rehearsed her next moves. The Patek Philippe watch lay hidden in a secret compartment of her jewelry box. Valuable collateral, but increasingly dangerous to possess. Her phone chimed with a text from one of her creditors. "Payment due today. No extensions." Jennifer cursed softly. Gambling debts to ordinary casinos could be managed. But owing money to the private high-stakes games run by Vincent Moretti was another matter entirely. Moretti didn't send threatening letters. He sent people who broke things. Starting with fingers, The bedroom door opened and David Anderson emerged, already dressed in a perfectly tailored suit at 35. He had his adoptive father's height, but none of Robert's intensity or drive. Jennifer had married him for the Anderson name and fortune, only to discover that Robert maintained iron control over the family purse strings. "You were out late last night," David commented, adjusting his cufflinks. Jennifer offered her practiced smile. "Charity committee meeting. You know how these society women love to talk." David studied her for a moment. Though not as shrewd as his father, he wasn't a fool. "The foundation called yesterday. They said you missed the last 3 meetings." "Must be a miscommunication." Jennifer moved to straighten his tie. A calculated gesture of intimacy. "You've been so busy with work, and I've been trying to support you by meeting with Daniel Carter after hours." David's voice remained calm, but his eyes had hardened. "Security saw you entering his office last night." Jennifer's mind raced through possible explanations. "Robert asked me to discuss the renovation budget with him. He thought Daniel might listen to family instead of seeing it as executive interference. Funny. When I mentioned that meeting to Robert this morning, he had no idea what I was talking about." Jennifer's mask slipped momentarily before she recovered. "Your father has been distracted with this watch business and that housekeeper. Perhaps he forgot." "Perhaps." David stepped back. "I have meetings all day. Don't wait up." The coolness in his tone made it clear the conversation wasn't over, merely postponed. After he left, Jennifer moved quickly to her closet, pulling out a designer handbag she rarely used. From a hidden pocket, she extracted a small key that opened the wall safe behind an abstract painting. Inside were documents she'd collected over years of strategic eavesdropping and careful theft from the Anderson family archives. Insurance for exactly this kind of situation. Among them was a file labeled simply WAEM 1970 that contained letters, legal agreements, and photographs documenting the affair between William Anderson and a young medical student named Elizabeth Miller. Jennifer had discovered it during a weekend at the Anderson family estate, when her father-in-law James had been in declining health, and Robert preoccupied with business. The file confirmed what she'd pieced together. Robert was the biological son of William Anderson and Elizabeth Miller, given up for adoption to William's brother James and his wife after a substantial payment to Elizabeth. What the file didn't explain was why Elizabeth had later reappeared as the surgeon who saved Robert's life, or why she now worked as a maid in his hotel. Jennifer placed the most incriminating documents in her bag. It was time to accelerate her partnership with Daniel Carter, her leverage against both Robert and her increasingly suspicious husband. At Columbia Presbyterian, Elizabeth opened her eyes to find Margaret dozing in a chair beside her bed. The events of the previous day came rushing back, collapsing in the hotel room. Robert's questions about her scar, the terrifying knowledge that both her sons were now circling each other without knowing their true connection. "Maggie," she called softly. Margaret startled awake. "Liz, thank God." She leaned forward, taking Elizabeth's hand. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck." Elizabeth tried to sit up. "I need to get out of here." "You're not going anywhere." Margaret adjusted the bed to help her sit. "Dr. Patterson wants to run more tests. Your heart isn't in good shape, Liz." Elizabeth waved this away impatiently. "My heart hasn't been in good shape for 30 years. Where's Robert? Was he really here? Or did I dream that?" "He was here," Margaret confirmed. "Stayed for hours until I convinced him to go home. He's asking questions, Liz. About you. About why you left medicine. About why you seem familiar to him." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly. "Did you tell him anything?" "Of course not. But Liz," Margaret hesitated, "I think he suspects something, the way he looks at you. It's like he's trying to place a half-remembered face." "I always knew this day might come," Elizabeth said quietly. "I just thought I'd be ready." "Ready for what?" "To tell him you're his biological mother, that you gave him up, then saved his life 30 years ago, without telling him who you were, that his half-brother is the one who nearly killed him in that accident." Margaret's voice was gentle, but insistent. "The truth is going to come out, one way or another. Wouldn't it be better coming from you?" Before Elizabeth could respond, a nurse entered with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller. How are we feeling today?" "Ready to leave," Elizabeth replied firmly. The nurse smiled indulgently. "Let's see what Dr. Patterson says first." "Oh, these came for you early this morning." She placed a stunning arrangement of white roses on the bedside table. The cards tucked in there somewhere. After the nurse left, Margaret retrieved the small envelope from among the blooms. "From Robert Anderson," she read. "Wishing you a speedy recovery. The Belvedere isn't the same without you." Elizabeth touched one of the roses gently. White roses were William's favorite. He used to bring me one every time we met. The memory still had the power to hurt after all these years. "Liz," Margaret leaned closer. "There's something else you should know last night." An older nurse recognized Robert. I overheard her telling another nurse he was the spitting image of William Anderson. "Word will spread." Elizabeth's hand fell from the roses. "Then I need to leave now. You can't just check yourself out after a cardiac event. Be reasonable." "I've never had that luxury, Maggie." Elizabeth's voice was steel beneath the fatigue. "If I don't get to Michael first, there's no telling what might happen." Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his hotel suite. The contents of the flash drive Jennifer had given him displayed on his laptop. The security footage from 30 years ago was grainy but clear enough to show the emergency room entrance on that rainy night. Timestamps matched the accident records. 11:42 p.m. A trauma team rushing out to meet an ambulance. 11:47 p.m. Elizabeth, younger but unmistakable, directing the team as they wheeled in a stretcher carrying an unconscious young man. The footage jumped to the operating room observation window. Elizabeth working frantically, her team responding to her rapid-fire commands. Blood everywhere at one point. At one, she grimaced in pain, but continued working. The moment she must have received the distinctive scar. Hours compressed into minutes on the footage. But it was clear, his mother had fought death itself to save Robert Anderson. But why? If Robert was the son of the man who'd ruined her career, the son she'd been forced to give up for adoption, why save him? And why keep her identity secret all these years? The final clip answered one question while raising countless others. Elizabeth, still in bloody scrubs, slumping against a wall in an empty hallway, clutching something in her hand. The camera angle shifted slightly, revealing what appeared to be a medallion on a chain. She looked at it for a long moment, then glanced up and down the corridor before slipping it around the unconscious Robert's neck in the recovery room. Daniel paused the footage, zooming in as much as the resolution allowed. A St. Luke medal, the same one Robert still wore. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. "Jennifer, I need to see you immediately," she said without preamble. "I have something you'll want to see, and we need to move quickly." "I'm busy," Daniel replied coldly. "Too busy for proof that Robert Anderson is your half-brother." The line went silent. Jennifer pressed her advantage. "That's right. I know. And I have documents that will help us both get what we want. Meet me at the Pierre in 30 minutes. After she hung up, Daniel sat motionless, staring at the frozen image of his mother from 30 years ago. Since learning the devastating truth about his parentage, he'd been re-examining everything he thought he knew. His mother hadn't told him to leave the country to protect Robert Anderson. She'd done it to protect him, her son, from the consequences of nearly killing his own half-brother in a drunken accident. The realization made him physically ill. For 30 years, he'd nurtured his hatred for the Andersons. Believing they had somehow forced his mother out of medicine as punishment for an unknown sin, he'd dedicated his life to infiltrating their company, gaining Robert's trust, all to destroy the family from within. But if Robert was his half-brother, if his mother had saved Robert's life and then hidden her identity for decades, working as a maid in his hotel just to be near him, what did that mean for Daniel's mission of vengeance? At the Belvedere, Robert was reviewing security footage from every floor, determined to find whoever had taken his father's watch. The theft itself was becoming secondary to the larger mystery surrounding Elizabeth Miller. But he needed to maintain the appearance of focusing on hotel business. Wilson hovered nervously at his side. "Sir, I've interviewed all staff who had access to your suite. Nothing suspicious so far." "What about the surveillance blind spots, service corridors, back staircases?" "Being reviewed now." "Sir," Wilson hesitated. "About Mrs. Miller, her condition?" "Stable," Robert replied shortly. "Have her personal effects been secured?" "Yes, sir. Her locker has been locked and her cart inventoried, as per protocol for suspended employees." Robert's head snapped up. "Suspended? Who authorized that?" Wilson paled slightly. "Standard procedure for employees under investigation, sir. I assumed..." "You assumed incorrectly." Robert's voice was dangerously calm. "Reinstate Mrs. Miller immediately, and prepare guest suite 2010 for her use upon release from the hospital. She'll need time to recuperate before returning to work." A guest suite? For a housekeeper? Wilson couldn't hide his shock. "Is there a problem, Wilson?" "No, sir, of course not." After Wilson scurried away, Robert returned to his temporary office, closing the door behind him. On his desk lay a slim folder, the preliminary report from his investigator. It contained nothing he didn't already know. Elizabeth Miller, former cardiac surgeon, had resigned from Columbia Presbyterian 30 years ago, citing personal reasons, no professional complaints, no malpractice suits, just a brilliant career abruptly abandoned. What the report didn't explain was why she had chosen to work at the Belvedere specifically, or why she seemed both drawn to and terrified of Robert himself. Something was missing, a crucial piece of the puzzle that would make everything else make sense. His phone rang. The hospital. "Mr. Anderson, this is Dr. Patterson. I thought you should know Mrs. Miller is insisting on checking herself out against medical advice. Given her condition, I'm concerned, but legally I can't stop her." Robert stood immediately. "I'm on my way." Across town at the Belvedere Hotel, Jennifer and Daniel sat in a secluded corner of the bar, documents spread between them. "These prove it," Jennifer said, tapping a yellowed legal agreement. "William Anderson, Robert's biological father, paid Elizabeth Miller a substantial sum to give up her baby for adoption to his brother James. Your mother used that money to finish medical school." Daniel stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, his mother's handwriting, dated 9 months before Robert's birth. "Where did you get these?" "The Anderson family keeps meticulous records of their dirty little secrets." Jennifer's smile was cold. "I found these years ago while snooping through James Anderson's study during a family weekend. Insurance policy, you might say. And what do you want in exchange for these?" Daniel's voice was carefully neutral. Jennifer leaned forward. "Your help taking control of Anderson Hotels with these documents, we can threaten to expose the fact that Robert isn't a real Anderson by blood. He's the illegitimate son of William, not James. The board is traditional enough that it would create chaos, potentially opening the door for David to take control. And why would I help put your husband in charge? Because I can manage David. And because I'll make sure you get a significant payout, enough to disappear comfortably if that's what you want." Jennifer studied him. "But I think what you really want is to hurt Robert. These documents give you that power." Daniel gathered the papers, his expression unreadable. "I need time to think. Don't take too long." Jennifer's voice hardened. "I have debts that won't wait, and neither will I." After she left, Daniel ordered a scotch and sat alone, turning over the pieces of a puzzle that was reshaping his entire life. His mother had given up one son for money, then saved his life 3 decades later without revealing her identity. She'd sent her other son away after he nearly killed his own half-brother in an accident. And now all 3 of them were circling each other in an elaborate dance of secrets and lies. The truth, Daniel realized, was far more complicated than the revenge fantasy he'd nurtured for 30 years. Back at the Belvedere, a maid named Sophia was cleaning the executive floor when she noticed Jennifer Anderson slip into Daniel Carter's office using a key. Curious, Sophia moved closer to the partially open door, pretending to dust the hallway table. Inside, Jennifer moved methodically through Daniel's desk drawers until she found what she was looking for, the flash drive. She pocketed it quickly, then opened his laptop. Finding it password protected, she cursed softly and began searching for any papers or notes that might be useful. Sophia, realizing what she was witnessing, backed away quietly. She'd seen Mrs. Miller humiliated publicly over the missing watch. Now here was Mrs. Anderson stealing from Mr. Carter's office. The connection wasn't hard to make. Sophia retreated to the service stairwell, heart pounding. Mrs. Miller had always been kind to her, helping her learn English when she first started at the Belvedere. The thought of telling Mr. Wilson what she'd seen was terrifying. He could fire her on the spot, and she had 3 children to support. But the alternative, letting Mrs. Miller take the blame for something she clearly didn't do, was unthinkable. Taking a deep breath, Sophia made her decision. She would tell Mr. Anderson directly what she had seen. Mrs. Miller deserved that much. At Columbia Presbyterian, Elizabeth was signing discharge papers against medical advice when Robert arrived. He took in the scene. Elizabeth already dressed in her street clothes, Margaret hovering anxiously nearby, the doctor's obvious disapproval, Mrs. Miller, he said. "I'm glad to see you're feeling better." Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she signed the final form. "Mr. Anderson, this isn't necessary. I can take care of myself. I've arranged a suite for you at the Belvedere during your recovery," Robert continued as if she hadn't spoken. "The hotel's doctor will check on you daily, and you'll remain on the payroll during your convalescence." Elizabeth met his gaze directly for the first time. "Why are you doing this?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Robert held her gaze, searching for something in her eyes. Recognition, confirmation, truth. "Let's just say I believe in taking care of those who have taken care of me," he finally said, whether I knew it at the time or not. For a moment, something shifted in Elizabeth's expression, a softening, a glimmer of the young woman she had once been. Then the mask of professional detachment returned. "Very well," she said quietly. "Thank you." As Robert helped Elizabeth into the waiting town car, neither of them noticed the photographer across the street, capturing the moment with a telephoto lens. Jennifer had hired him that morning. One more piece of insurance in her increasingly desperate game. The storm clouds gathering once more over Manhattan seemed an appropriate backdrop for the drama unfolding beneath them. A drama that would soon break with a fury none of them were prepared for. Evening settled over Manhattan, the city lights reflecting in puddles from the day's intermittent rain. In Daniel Carter's suite at the Belvedere, he poured himself a third scotch. Documents from Jennifer's file and printouts from the security footage spread across the coffee table like pieces of a broken mosaic he was trying to reassemble. The photograph of his young mother with William Anderson lay at the center, the missing piece that changed everything. The resemblance between William and Robert was unmistakable, as was the look of adoration on his mother's young face as she gazed up at William. His secure phone buzzed with a message from his hospital contact. "EM, checked herself out, AMA, RA, escorted her back to Belvedere, installed in suite 2010. Daniel set his glass down hard enough that amber liquid sloshed over the rim. His mother was here, in this very building, with Robert looking after her personally. The walls of his carefully constructed revenge were closing in. A soft knock at his door jolted him from his thoughts. Quickly, he gathered the documents, shoving them into a folder and hiding it behind the minibar before opening the door. Jennifer stood there, expression tense. "We need to talk." "It's not a good time," Daniel began, but she pushed past him. "Robert's installed your mother in a guest suite," she said without preamble. "He's asking questions about her past at the hospital. Whatever timeline we were working with just accelerated." Daniel closed the door. "How do you know this?" "I have sources." Jennifer paced the room. "We need to move now, before he uncovers the truth on his own." "And what exactly is your plan?" Daniel watched her carefully. Wave these documents in his face and demand, "What? That he step down? Give you money? What's your end game here?" Jennifer stopped pacing. "My end game is survival, Daniel. I owe people, dangerous people, a lot of money. Money I don't have because Robert keeps David on a short leash financially." Her composure cracked slightly. "I need leverage to force Robert to transfer control of the company to David, who will be much more generous with the family fortune. And if I refuse to help you," her smile was cold, "then I go to Robert myself with what I know about you. That you're Michael Miller, Elizabeth's son, the driver who nearly killed him 30 years ago and fled the scene. That you've infiltrated his company under a false identity to exact some misguided revenge." She moved closer. "How do you think he'll react to that?" The threat hung in the air between them. Daniel knew she was desperate enough to follow through. "Fine," he said finally. "But we do this my way. No confronting Robert directly yet. I need to speak with my mother first." Jennifer's eyes narrowed. "Why? So you can warn her. Give her time to disappear again. Because if we're going to blow up all our lives, I at least want to understand why she did what she did." Daniel's voice hardened. "That's my condition. Take it or leave it." After a tense moment, Jennifer nodded. "You have until tomorrow night. Then I go to Robert myself." As she turned to leave, Daniel added, "If you're working with me, I expect honesty. Did you take Anderson's watch?" Jennifer paused at the door. "Insurance," she said without turning around. "I needed leverage. I never expected him to publicly accuse your mother." After she left, Daniel poured another drink, his mind racing. He needed answers from his mother. but the thought of facing her after 30 years of silence and the revelations of the past few days was almost unbearable. The hatred he'd nurtured for the Andersons, the fuel that had driven him for decades, was being replaced by confusion and a growing sense that he'd been pursuing the wrong target all along. The next morning, Sofia Martinez nervously approached the executive offices, rehearsing what she would say to Mr. Anderson. She'd tried the previous evening, but he hadn't returned to the hotel after escorting Mrs. Miller from the hospital. "Sophia, you needed to see me." Robert looked up from his desk as Wilson showed her in, clearly puzzled by the request from a housekeeper. "Yes, Mr. Anderson, thank you for seeing me." Sophia twisted her hands anxiously. "It's about the missing watch." Robert's attention sharpened. "Go on." "Yesterday I saw Mrs. Anderson in Mr. Carter's office when he wasn't there. She was searching through his desk and took something. A small drive." Sophia spoke quickly, afraid she would lose her nerve. "And the day your watch disappeared. I saw her coming from your suite when you were in a meeting. I didn't think anything of it then. But after seeing her take things from Mr. Carter's office..." Robert's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had hardened. "You're sure about this?" Sophia nodded. "Mrs. Miller is a good person. She helped me when I first came here. With my English, with finding a doctor when my son was sick. She wouldn't steal. Thank you, Sophia." Robert's tone was gentle. "You did the right thing coming to me directly." After she left, Robert sat motionless, processing this new information. Jennifer had taken his watch, that fit her pattern of financial desperation he'd been tracking through her credit card statements, and unusual withdrawals from accounts she shared with David. But what was she doing in Daniel's office? What connection did those two have? His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Anderson, there's a Margaret Jenkins here to see you. She says it's about Elizabeth Miller." "Send her in." Margaret entered, her expression grave. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. You're here about Elizabeth," Robert said, gesturing for her to sit. "How is she?" "Physically stable, but..." Margaret hesitated. "I'm worried about her mental state. She's afraid, Mr. Anderson. More afraid than I've seen her in 30 years. "Afraid of what?" "Not what. Who?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "She's afraid of what might happen when you and Michael finally learn the truth about each other." Robert went very still. "Michael, her son." Margaret watched his reaction carefully. "The son she raised alone after you were..." She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd said too much. "After I was what, Miss Jenkins?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. Margaret sighed deeply. "That's not my story to tell, but I will say this. Elizabeth has sacrificed everything to protect both her children. Everything. Her career, her reputation, her future. And now it's all coming apart because you bought this hotel. Both her children," Robert repeated slowly. A suspicion that had been forming in his mind suddenly crystallized. "Miss Jenkins, is Daniel Carter actually Michael Miller?" The shock on Margaret's face was answer enough. "How did you..." "It was just a theory until now." Robert stood, moving to the window. "It explains his inexplicable interest in Elizabeth, his strange reaction when he saw her in my office." He turned back to Margaret. "But it doesn't explain why Elizabeth gave up medicine to work as a maid in my hotel, or why Daniel, Michael, seems to hate me when we've never met before." Margaret rose, gathering her purse. "Ask Elizabeth those questions, Mr. Anderson. And when you do, remember that every choice she made out of love." She headed for the door, then paused. "One more thing. Check the St. Luke medal you wear. Check it closely." After she left, Robert's hand went to the medallion he'd worn since childhood, the one his adoptive mother told him came from his birth mother. He'd never examined it carefully, seeing it more as a good luck charm than anything significant. Now, with trembling fingers, he removed it from around his neck for the first time in decades. It was tarnished with age, the image of St. Luke worn smooth from years of handling. He turned it over, looking for anything unusual. The edge seemed thicker than it should be. Carefully, he pressed his thumbnail along the seam and felt something give. The back of the medallion was actually a tiny locket, designed to hold a small paper or photograph. Inside was a folded slip of paper, yellowed with age. Written in a delicate script were the words, "The truth will set you free, my son. E.M. Elizabeth Miller, his birth mother." Robert sat heavily in his chair, the medallion clutched in his fist, as 30 years of dreams and inexplicable feelings of connection suddenly made terrible, beautiful sense. In sweet 2010, Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the city below. The luxury of the room, with its king-sized bed, marble bathroom, and panoramic views, was a stark contrast to her modest apartment. But physically comfortable as it was, she felt like a prisoner awaiting execution. A knock at the door startled her. Expecting hotel staff, she was shocked to see Daniel standing there, his expression unreadable. "Michael," she whispered, using the name she'd given him at birth. "It's Daniel now," he corrected coldly. "May I come in?" Elizabeth stepped back, allowing him to enter. Neither spoke as he paced the suite, taking in the opulent surroundings. "Quite an upgrade from cleaning these rooms," he finally said. "Michael, Daniel." Elizabeth struggled to find words. "I never expected to see you again. That was the plan, wasn't it?" His voice was controlled, but anger simmered beneath the surface. "Send me away with a new identity. Make me believe I was protecting you, when really you were protecting him. Him, my half-brother, Robert Anderson." Daniel pulled the photograph from his pocket, laying it on the coffee table between them. "Your firstborn son." The color drained from Elizabeth's face. "Where did you get that?" "Your apartment. I'm sorry for the intrusion, but I needed answers you weren't giving me." He sat across from her. 30 years, Mom. 30 years of believing the Andersons destroyed your career, forced you into menial work. I dedicated my life to making them pay." "Oh, Michael." Elizabeth's voice broke. "That's not what happened at all." "Then tell me the truth. All of it, starting with why you gave up one son for adoption but kept the other." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph. "I was 20 when I met William Anderson, a second-year medical student. Brilliant but poor. He was 35, married, heir to the Anderson Hotel empire." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "We fell in love. It sounds trite now, but it was everything then. When I got pregnant, his father gave me a choice. Take money and give up the baby, or they would ensure I never practice medicine. So you chose your career over your child." Daniel's voice was harsh. "I chose survival," Elizabeth corrected quietly. "I had nothing. No family, no support. The money they gave me put me through medical school, gave me a future. William promised he would watch over the baby. His brother James and his wife couldn't have children, so they adopted Robert." Pain flashed across her face. "William died in a sailing accident a year later. After that, James made sure I never saw Robert. Until the accident." Daniel's expression was unreadable. Elizabeth nodded slowly. "Until the accident, I was chief of cardiac surgery by then, when they brought him in. I didn't know it was him at first, just another trauma victim. Then I saw the St. Luke medal around his neck." Her voice caught. "I'd given it to him when he was born, left a note inside. It was the only thing of me he had. And when you realized who he was, who I had almost killed, I did what any surgeon would do. Everything possible to save him." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "And then I did what any mother would do. Everything possible to protect both her sons. By sending me away with a false identity," Daniel said bitterly. "By letting me believe I was protecting you from the Andersons' retribution. You were drunk, Michael, distraught about finding your adoption papers. You hit Robert's car and fled the scene. If they had found you, you would have gone to prison." Elizabeth leaned forward urgently. "I couldn't lose both my sons in one night, so you sacrificed your career instead." Elizabeth nodded. "I resigned before anyone could connect me to the accident. Used almost all my savings to set you up with a new identity overseas. And then you got a job as a maid in Robert's hotel," Daniel finished. "To be near him without him knowing. To watch over him," Elizabeth corrected softly. "From a distance. It was all I could give him." Daniel stood abruptly, moving to the window. "And now what? Robert's investigating you. Jennifer Anderson is threatening to expose everything unless I help her take control of the company." He turned to face his mother. "The truth is going to come out one way or another." "Jennifer?" Elizabeth looked confused. "What does she have to do with this?" "She took Robert's watch as leverage. She has documents about your relationship with William, the adoption, everything." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "She's desperate, in debt to some dangerous people. wants control of the Anderson fortune through her husband. Elizabeth absorbed this in silence. Finally, she said, "If the truth is going to come out, it should come from me. Both my sons deserve that much." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Meeting moved up. My office, 1 hour. Bring the documents or I go to Robert alone. He showed the message to Elizabeth, whose expression hardened with resolve. "It's time to end this," she said. Rising, all of it, across the hotel, in the executive suite, Robert was on the phone with his investigator. "I need everything you can find on Daniel Carter. Real name Michael Miller. Focus on the night of my accident 30 years ago." He paused, staring at the medallion on his desk. "And get me the police report from that night. The complete, unredacted version." As he hung up, there was a knock at his door. Wilson entered, looking anxious as usual. "Sir, Mrs. Anderson is asking to see you. She says it's urgent." Robert's expression hardened. "Send her in." Jennifer swept in, the picture of elegant concern. "Robert, I've been so worried. This obsession with the housekeeper? Save it." Robert interrupted coldly. "I know you took my watch, Jennifer." She froze momentarily before recovering. "That's absurd. Why would I? You were seen coming from my suite when I was in meetings, and later taking something from Daniel Carter's office. Return the watch, and we can discuss this privately, as family. Otherwise, I'll have hotel security search your suite right now." Jennifer's composure cracked. "You wouldn't dare. Think of the scandal. Try me." Robert's voice was ice. For a long moment, they stared at each other in silent confrontation. Then Jennifer reached into her purse and pulled out the Patek Philippe, placing it on the desk between them. "Fine. You have your precious watch back, but this isn't over." Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You think you know everything, don't you? The great Robert Anderson, built on lies from the beginning. What are you talking about?" Jennifer smiled coldly. "Ask your housekeeper about William Anderson. Ask her why she gave up one son but kept the other. Ask her why Michael Miller disappeared after nearly killing you 30 years ago." The color drained from Robert's face. "Get out." "With pleasure." Jennifer moved to the door. "But this conversation isn't over. Not by a long shot." After she left, Robert stared at the watch on his desk. The last gift from the man he'd believed was his father. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, his life, was unraveling with breathtaking speed. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Anderson, Elizabeth Miller is here to see you." "She says it's urgent." Robert took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever came next. "Send her in." The door opened, and Elizabeth entered, looking frail but determined. Behind her, surprisingly, was Daniel Carter. "Mr. Anderson," Elizabeth said formally, "there are things you need to know. Things I should have told you long ago." Robert gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "I believe you're right, Mrs. Miller." He reached for the St. Luke medallion, holding it up between them. "Or should I call you Mother?" For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft patter of rain against the windows as another storm swept over Manhattan. Elizabeth stared at the medallion dangling from Robert's fingers, her face a canvas of complex emotions. Relief, fear, sorrow, and something deeper. A mother's love, buried for decades but never extinguished. "You found it," she whispered. "The note inside?" Robert nodded, his expression unreadable. "The truth will set you free, my son." He set the medallion on the desk between them. "I've worn this my entire life, never knowing it contained the answer to the question that's haunted me since childhood. Who am I really?" Daniel stood rigidly by the door, watching the interaction between the mother who had raised him and the half-brother he'd spent years plotting against. The surreal nature of the moment wasn't lost on him. 3 strangers connected by blood and tragedy, finally facing each other with the truth laid bare. Elizabeth lowered herself slowly into one of the chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "I don't know where to begin." "The beginning would be appropriate," Robert said, his voice controlled but strained. "William Anderson was my biological father." "Yes." Elizabeth met his gaze directly for the first time. "I was a second-year medical student when we met. He was funding a research program I was part of. She hesitated. "We fell in love, despite the complications. When I became pregnant, his father intervened. The choice was simple: Give up the baby and take enough money to finish medical school, or refuse and have my career destroyed before it began. So you chose your career over your child, Robert said, echoing Daniel's earlier accusation. I chose the only path that gave both of us a future. Elizabeth's voice strengthened. William promised you would be well cared for by his brother James, that one day, when the time was right, he would tell you the truth. But William died, Robert filled in. Sailing accident, if I remember the family history correctly. Elizabeth nodded. After that, James made it clear I was to stay away. The money I'd received came with legal documents. A gag order, essentially. If I ever tried to contact you, I would have to return every penny, plus interest. I would have lost everything. My medical license, my reputation, everything I'd worked for. So you stayed away, Robert stated flatly. Until the accident. Elizabeth glanced at Daniel, who had moved to stand by the window, his back to them. 30 years ago, my son, Michael, discovered his adoption papers. He was already struggling with a failing marriage, drinking too much that night in the rain, driving recklessly. Her voice faltered. He hit my car, Robert finished, his gaze shifting to Daniel's back, and fled the scene, leaving me to die. Daniel turned sharply. I didn't know who you were. I was drunk, panicked. His voice was rough with suppressed emotion. I've spent 30 years hating the Andersons for what I thought they did to my mother I never knew. He trailed off, unable to finish. You never knew I was your half-brother, Robert completed the thought. The son your mother gave away. Elizabeth rose unsteadily. When they brought you into the ER that night, I didn't recognize you at first. You were just another trauma victim. Then I saw the St. Luke medal. I knew immediately who you were. But by then, I was already fighting to save your life. And you did. Robert's tone softened slightly. 12 hours of surgery, a cut on your hand that left that distinctive scar. Elizabeth touched her scarred palm reflexively. Afterward, when you were stable, I realized the implications. If anyone discovered Michael was the hit-and-run driver, he would go to prison. If anyone connected me to you, questions would be asked that could destroy us all. So you resigned, Robert said, gave up your career, sent Michael away with a new identity, and let everyone believe he had died abroad, Elizabeth confirmed. It was the only way to protect both my sons. And then you became a maid in my hotel, Robert said, the pieces finally falling into place. To be near me without my knowing. To watch over you, Elizabeth corrected gently. From a distance. It was all I could give you. A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the darkening sky. The storm was intensifying, mirroring the emotional turbulence within. Finally, Robert spoke. Why now? After 30 years of silence, why come forward today? Daniel moved from the window. Jennifer Anderson. She discovered documents about your birth, about the accident. She's using them as leverage to try to gain control of the company through her husband. Jennifer. Robert's expression hardened. I should have known. She returned my watch just before you arrived, after I confronted her with evidence she'd taken it. She's desperate, Daniel explained. In debt to dangerous people. She sees the Anderson fortune as her only way out. She's meeting us in an hour, Elizabeth added, threatening to expose everything if Daniel doesn't help her take control of the company. Robert's laugh held no humor. So this isn't a family reunion driven by sudden conscience. It's damage control. No, Elizabeth said firmly. This is 30 years overdue, Jennifer forced the timing, but I've carried this burden long enough. She leaned forward, her eyes holding Robert's. You deserve to know the truth. Both of you did. Robert stood abruptly, turning to the rain-streaked windows. The St. Luke medal lay on the desk between them, a physical manifestation of the secret that had connected and divided them for decades. My entire life has been built on a lie, he said quietly. The man I called father, James, was actually my uncle. The woman who raised me wasn't my mother. My real mother has been cleaning my hotel rooms. And the hit-and-run driver who nearly killed me is actually my half-brother who's been working alongside me for months. Robert, Elizabeth began, but he held up a hand. I need time to process this. He turned back to face them. As for Jennifer, I'll handle her myself. Be careful, Daniel warned. She's cornered and desperate. The documents she has. Letters between you and William. The adoption agreement. Police reports from the accident. They could cause a scandal that would affect the company's stock. The board's confidence in your leadership. Let me worry about Jennifer and the company. Robert's voice was steel. Right now, I need you both to leave. We'll continue this conversation when I've had time to think. Elizabeth rose shakily. Robert, please understand. Every choice I made was to protect both of you. That may be, Robert replied, his voice softening slightly. But understanding will take time. As Elizabeth and Daniel moved toward the door, Robert added, Daniel, or should I call you Michael? Daniel paused. I've been Daniel Carter so long, I barely remember being Michael Miller. Well, Daniel, consider yourself on administrative leave until further notice. Whatever happens with Jennifer, our professional relationship will need reevaluation. After they left, Robert sank into his chair, physically and emotionally drained. The medallion caught his eye, the tangible link to a mother he'd never known he had. With careful fingers, he refolded the yellowed note and returned it to its hiding place, then slipped the chain back around his neck. His phone rang. The investigator with information on Daniel Carter's true identity and the accident from 30 years ago. Send everything to my secure email, Robert instructed, and find out everything you can about Jennifer Anderson's financial situation. Debts, loans, unusual payments. I need it within the hour. Across the hotel, Jennifer paced her suite, anxiety mounting with each passing minute. Her contact at the bank had called. Moretti's associates would be expecting payment by midnight. The watch had been her insurance policy, and now Robert had it back. The documents were her only remaining leverage, but Daniel was proving less cooperative than she'd hoped. Her phone rang. David, where are you? He demanded without preamble. We need to talk. I'm busy, Jennifer replied curtly. Can it wait? No, it can't. David's voice was uncharacteristically hard. The bank called me about unusual withdrawals from our joint account, and Vincent Moretti's associates paid me a visit at the office. Something about outstanding debts. Jennifer froze. David, I can explain. Save it. He cut her off. I'm done with the lies. Either you meet me in the hotel bar in 30 minutes to explain everything, or I'm going directly to my father. Your choice. The line went dead. Jennifer stared at her phone, panic rising. Everything was falling apart. Daniel hadn't responded to her text. David knew about her gambling debts. Robert had recovered his watch. She needed a new plan. Immediately, with trembling fingers, she dialed another number. It's Jennifer Anderson. I need to see you right away. It's urgent. In Suite 2010, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, emotionally exhausted. Daniel stood by the window, watching the storm intensify over the city. What now? He asked quietly. Now we wait, Elizabeth replied. Robert needs time. It's a lot to absorb. He hates us, Daniel said flatly. No, Elizabeth shook her head. He's hurt, confused, angry, but hate requires indifference, and Robert is anything but indifferent. She studied her son's profile, so like his father's. What about you? Do you still hate the Andersons? Still want revenge? Daniel was silent for a long moment. I spent 30 years building a life around that hatred. Now I discover my target is my half-brother, the victim of my own recklessness. He turned to face her. I don't know what I feel anymore. Forgiveness takes time, Elizabeth said gently. For all of us. Jennifer won't wait for forgiveness, Daniel reminded her. She expects me at her office in 30 minutes with those documents. Then you should go, Elizabeth said. Keep her contained until Robert decides how to handle her. Daniel hesitated. And you? I'll be here. Elizabeth managed a tired smile. I've waited 30 years for this day. A few more hours won't matter. After Daniel left, Elizabeth moved slowly to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. The woman in the mirror looked every one of her 75 years today, the weight of decades of secrets etched in the lines around her eyes and mouth. Her chest tightened suddenly, a sharp pain radiating down her left arm. She fumbled in her purse for her medication, swallowing a pill dry. The doctor had warned her that stress could trigger another event. She needed to stay calm, focused, breathing deeply until the pain subsided. Elizabeth returned to the bedroom and lay down. Suddenly exhausted, Just a short rest, she told herself, closing her eyes. Then she would face whatever came next. In the hotel bar, David Anderson sat nursing a scotch, his normally pleasant face set in grim lines. At 35, he had lived his entire life in Robert's shadow, the adopted son who could never quite measure up to his father's expectations. Jennifer, with her beauty and social connections, had seemed like his path to independence, to respect. Instead, she had enmeshed them in secrets and lies he was only beginning to uncover. When Jennifer arrived, her usual confident stride was missing. She slid into the booth across from him, immediately reaching for his drink and draining it. "That bad?" David remarked coldly. "David, I can explain everything," Jennifer began, her voice low and urgent. "I made some mistakes, got in over my head, but I have a plan to fix it all. By stealing my father's watch, by meeting secretly with his CFO, by borrowing from Vincent Moretti." David's voice rose slightly. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that man is?" "I was trying to protect you," Jennifer insisted. "Robert keeps you on a leash financially. The company should be yours. You're his son. I was just trying to secure what should rightfully be ours." David stared at her with new eyes. "You married me for the Anderson name and fortune, didn't you? It was never about love." Jennifer's silence was answer enough. David signaled the bartender for another drink. "What's your plan?" he finally asked. "The one that's supposedly going to fix everything." Jennifer leaned forward. "I have documents. Proof that Robert isn't James Anderson's biological son. He's the illegitimate child of William Anderson and a woman named Elizabeth Miller, the housekeeper, the one accused of stealing the watch." David couldn't hide his shock. "The very same," Jennifer confirmed. "She's Robert's biological mother, and Daniel Carter is actually her other son, Robert's half-brother." David sat back, stunned. "That's impossible." "It's the truth," Jennifer insisted. "With these documents, we could force Robert out. The board is traditional enough that a scandal like this, the CEO not being a real Anderson by blood, would create chaos. You could step in as James's only remaining heir. And what would this accomplish? Besides destroying my father?" David's voice was quiet but intense. "It would put us in control," Jennifer said, as if it were obvious. "No more allowances, no more asking permission for every expense. We'd have direct access to the Anderson fortune, to pay off your gambling debts," David concluded flatly. Jennifer's eyes flashed. "Among other things, but primarily to secure our future." David studied his wife carefully. "Where are these documents now?" "Safe," Jennifer replied vaguely. "I'm meeting Daniel, Michael, whatever he's calling himself, in 15 minutes to discuss next steps." "I'm coming with you," David said, standing. "That's not necessary. It wasn't a request." David cut her off. "You've played games with my family long enough. It's time I understood exactly what's happening." In his office, Robert reviewed the files his investigator had sent. The police report from 30 years ago contained witness statements that had somehow never made it into the final investigation. Statements describing a second vehicle following Robert's car that night, forcing him off the road into the path of the oncoming vehicle driven by Michael Miller. It wasn't simply an accident caused by a drunk driver. It had been orchestrated. The financial report on Jennifer was equally illuminating. Her gambling debts to Vincent Moretti totaled nearly $3 million. With a midnight deadline for payment, she'd been systematically emptying accounts she shared with David, selling jewelry, even taking loans against property she didn't own. Robert's intercom buzzed. "Sir, Thomas Wilson is requesting to see you urgently." "Send him in." Wilson entered, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Anderson, there's a situation developing. Mrs. Anderson is meeting with Mr. Carter in the executive conference room. They appear to be arguing. Hotel security thought you should be informed." "Thank you, Wilson." Robert stood, gathering the files on his desk. "Have security stand by, but do not intervene unless I specifically request it." As Wilson left, Robert placed a call to his most trusted security officer. "Jenkins, I need you to escort Elizabeth Miller from Suite 2010 to a secure location immediately. Use the service elevators and back corridors. No one is to know where she is." "Understood." "Yes, sir," came the crisp reply. "And if anyone asks for her, Tell them she's been moved to a medical facility for her safety." Robert checked his watch. "And Jenkins, stay with her. Do not leave her alone under any circumstances." Lightning flashed outside as Robert made one more call to his longtime attorney. "Richard, I need you to prepare transfer paperwork for controlling interest in the Pacific Resort portfolio to my son, David. Valuation approximately $500 million. And I need it within the hour." "Robert, that's highly unusual," the attorney protested. "Those properties are the cornerstone of your personal holdings." "Just do it," Robert instructed. "And prepare a separate document transferring $10 million to an account I'll specify later, with provisions for medical care and housing." After hanging up, Robert took the St. Luke medallion from around his neck, studying it one more time before slipping it into his pocket. Outside, thunder rumbled as the storm reached its peak. It was time to end this. All of it. In the executive conference room, Daniel faced Jennifer across the polished table, tension crackling between them. David stood by the door, observing with growing concern. "Where are the documents?" Jennifer demanded. "Safe," Daniel replied evenly. "But before I give you anything, I want to know exactly what you plan to do with them." "I already told you," Jennifer snapped. "Use them as leverage to force Robert to transfer control of the company to David. And if he refuses, then we go public," Jennifer said coldly. "The scandal alone would tank the company's stock, force the board to act either way. Robert Anderson loses everything. Just like my mother lost everything 30 years ago," Daniel remarked quietly. "Your mother made her choices," Jennifer dismissed. "Now we're making ours." "And what about my choices?" David interjected, moving closer. "You're talking about destroying my father, the company, our family name, all to pay off your gambling debts." Jennifer's eyes narrowed. "Don't be naive, David. This is business. Your father has controlled you your entire life, kept you from your rightful place in the company. I'm just accelerating the inevitable." "By blackmail and threats," David said incredulously. "Who are you? I don't even recognize you anymore." The door opened, and Robert entered, his expression calm, but his eyes hard as steel. "I believe I'm expected at this meeting." Jennifer straightened, a triumphant smile playing at her lips. "Robert, how nice of you to join us. We were just discussing family business." "So I gather." Robert closed the door behind him. "Blackmail, extortion, fraud. Quite the family enterprise you've built, Jennifer." "I prefer to call it leverage," Jennifer replied smoothly. "But whatever the terminology, the facts remain. I have documents that could destroy you, your position, and the company's reputation." She gestured toward Daniel. "And your long-lost half-brother here has the originals." "I see." Robert moved to the head of the table. "And what exactly are your demands?" "Transfer control of the company to David, effective immediately. Grant us access to the family trusts, and resign from the board." Jennifer's voice was steel beneath silk. "In return, these documents disappear forever." Robert's gaze shifted to his son. "And you, David, are you part of this conspiracy?" David shook his head, shame evident in his expression. "I only learned of it tonight. I had no idea she was planning this, or about your background." "I see." Robert turned his attention to Daniel. "And you? Is revenge against the Andersons still your primary motivation?" Daniel met his gaze steadily. "Not anymore. Learning you're my half-brother, understanding what our mother sacrificed for both of us, it changes things." "Yes," Robert agreed quietly. "It does." Lightning flashed outside, momentarily illuminating the room in stark white light, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm had reached its apex directly over them. "So," Jennifer broke the silence. "Do we have a deal?" Robert reached into his jacket, removing a folded document and placing it on the table. "I've already instructed my attorneys to transfer the Pacific Resort portfolio to David. Assets worth approximately $500 million, more than enough to clear your debts to Moretti and provide a comfortable life." Jennifer's eyes widened in surprise, then narrow suspicion. "Just like that? You're giving in without a fight." "Not giving in," Robert corrected. "Making a business decision. Those properties are a fraction of the company's holdings. A reasonable price to end this situation quickly and quietly." "And what about the company itself?" Jennifer pressed. "David's position. That's between my son and me. Robert's tone made it clear the subject was closed. The transfer will be complete within the hour. You'll have access to the funds by midnight, just in time to meet Moretti's deadline. Jennifer hesitated, sensing a trap but unable to identify it. The offer was generous, more than generous, but something about Robert's calm demeanor made her uneasy. "What's the catch?" she finally asked. "No catch," Robert replied evenly. "Just 3 conditions. First, you surrender all documents relating to my birth, Elizabeth Miller, and the accident 30 years ago. Second, you sign a confidentiality agreement that carries severe financial penalties for any breach. And third," he paused, his gaze hardening, "you file for divorce from my son immediately and relinquish any future claims on Anderson assets." David inhaled sharply. Jennifer's face flushed with anger. "You can't dictate my personal life," she hissed. "I'm not," Robert replied calmly. "I'm offering a business transaction. Assets in exchange for your silence and your exit from our family. The choice is yours." For a moment, Jennifer stood frozen, weighing her options. The money would solve her immediate problems with Moretti, but divorcing David would cut her off from future Anderson wealth. Still, $500 million was more than she'd expected to extract from this situation. "Fine," she said finally. "I accept your terms." "Good," Robert nodded to Daniel. "Now, I believe you have some documents for us." Daniel hesitated, then reached into his jacket and withdrew a USB drive. "Everything Jennifer gave me, plus what I found independently, all copies." Robert pocketed the drive. "Thank you, Daniel." He turned back to Jennifer. "My attorney will contact you tomorrow with the paperwork. Until then, I suggest you pack your things and move to a different hotel. Your access to Anderson accounts has been temporarily suspended as a precaution." Jennifer's expression was murderous, but she recognized defeat when she saw it. Without another word, she gathered her purse and strode from the room, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. "Dad," David began, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea she was planning this. I never wanted—" "I know, son." Robert's voice softened. "We'll talk later. Right now, I need to speak with Daniel privately." After David left, the half-brothers faced each other across the conference table. 30 years of secrets and misunderstandings between them. That was unexpectedly generous, Daniel finally said. "It's just money," Robert replied. "Family is what matters. Elizabeth taught me that today." Daniel nodded slowly. "What happens now with the 3 of us?" "I don't know," Robert admitted, "but I'd like to find out." He extended his hand across the table. "Maybe we could start again. Not as boss and employee, but as brothers." After a moment's hesitation, Daniel took the offered hand. "Brothers," he agreed quietly. As they shook, Robert's phone rang. Jenkins, the security officer he'd assigned to Elizabeth. "Mr. Anderson." Jenkins's voice was urgent. "You need to come to Suite 2010 immediately. It's Mrs. Miller. She's collapsed again, and this time it looks serious." The elevator couldn't move fast enough for Robert as he and Daniel raced to the 20th floor. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the building's foundation. Inside Robert's mind, an even greater tempest raged. The possibility of losing Elizabeth just when he'd found her, just when decades of secrets were finally unraveling. Jenkins met them at the door to Suite 2010, his professional demeanor cracking with genuine concern. "She was unconscious when I arrived to move her. I've called an ambulance. They're on their way up." Daniel pushed past him into the suite, Robert close behind. Elizabeth lay on the bed, deathly pale, her breathing shallow and labored. Margaret Jenkins sat beside her, holding her hand and speaking softly. "What happened?" Daniel demanded, kneeling beside the bed. "Another cardiac event, more severe than before," Margaret explained, her voice tight with worry. "She took her medication, but it wasn't enough. She needs a hospital immediately." Robert moved to Elizabeth's other side, taking her free hand. Her skin felt cold, her pulse weak beneath his fingers. "Elizabeth," he said softly, using her first name for the first time. "Hold on. Help is coming." Her eyelids fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settling on Robert's face. "William," she whispered. "No, it's Robert," he corrected gently. "Your son." A faint smile touched her lips. "My son," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Both my sons here. Daniel took her other hand, tears threatening. We're here, Mom. Both of us. The sound of sirens penetrated the room as the paramedics arrived. The next few minutes passed in controlled chaos. Medical terminology, equipment being prepared, Elizabeth being transferred to a stretcher. Through it all, she kept her eyes on her sons, as if memorizing their faces in case it was the last time she saw them. Columbia Presbyterian Cardiac Unit. Robert instructed the paramedics. Whatever she needs, cost is not an issue. Robert. Margaret pulled him aside while the paramedics secured Elizabeth for transport. You should know. Her heart is in worse shape than she's admitted. This might not be something she can recover from. The words hit him like a physical blow. How bad? Bad enough that she made me promise to give you this if anything happened. Margaret pressed a sealed envelope into his hand. She wrote it after her first episode. Robert stared at the envelope. His name written in elegant, slightly shaky handwriting. Did she know this might happen today? Elizabeth has always known the price of her choices, Margaret said softly. She just accepted it long ago. As the paramedics prepared to move Elizabeth, Robert approached once more. We're right behind you, he assured her. Daniel and I both. Elizabeth's gaze shifted between her sons, a lifetime of love and regret in her tired eyes. No matter what happens, she whispered, remember your brothers. Promise me. We promise, they answered in unison. As the paramedics wheeled her toward the service elevator, Robert turned to Daniel. My car's in the basement garage. We'll follow the ambulance. Daniel nodded, his face set in grim lines. Robert, if she doesn't make it, she will. Robert cut him off firmly. She survived worse than this. The drive to Columbia Presbyterian passed in tense silence, both men lost in their thoughts as the storm continued to rage. Robert clutched the steering wheel with white knuckles, pushing through the downpour at dangerous speeds. Beside him, Daniel stared out at the rain-slick streets, memories of another rainy night 30 years ago haunting him with cruel clarity. At the hospital, Elizabeth was immediately taken to the cardiac intensive care unit, leaving Robert and Daniel in the waiting room, the same one where Robert had sat just days earlier, unaware that the elderly housekeeper he was concerned about was actually his biological mother, Mr. Anderson. A doctor emerged after what felt like an eternity. I'm Dr. Patel, cardiology chief. We've stabilized Mrs. Miller for now, but her condition is critical. Her heart has sustained significant damage over the years, and this latest episode has weakened it further. What are her chances? Daniel asked bluntly. Dr. Patel hesitated. In patients her age with this cardiac history, the prognosis is challenging. We're preparing her for emergency surgery, but you should understand the risks. Is there anything that can be done? Robert pressed. Specialists, experimental treatments, money is no object. The best cardiologists in the city are already here, Mr. Anderson. Your family's donations made sure of that. Dr. Patel's expression softened. The next few hours will be critical. I suggest you prepare yourselves for all possibilities. After the doctor left, Robert sank into a chair, the envelope Margaret had given him still clutched in his hand. After a moment's hesitation, he broke the seal and removed a single folded page. What is it? Daniel asked, sitting beside him. A letter from Elizabeth. Robert unfolded it carefully. To both of us. The letter was written in the same elegant but slightly tremulous hand as the envelope. My dearest sons, if you're reading this, we finally come full circle, and the secrets I've kept for decades have come to light. I don't know how much you've discovered, or how you feel about what you've learned, but there are things I need to say while I still can, Robert. From the moment you were born, giving you up was the greatest pain I've ever known. Your father, William, promised to watch over you, to make sure James and his wife gave you the life I couldn't provide. When William died, that promise died with him. Not a day passed that I didn't think of you, wonder about you, love you from afar, Michael. Raising you was my greatest joy and privilege. Your father would have been so proud of the man you became when you discovered your adoption papers that night. I should have told you everything then. My silence cost us all dearly. The night of the accident when I saw you both in the hospital, one on an operating table fighting for his life, the other fleeing the scene in panic. I made the only choice a mother could. I sacrificed everything to protect you both. My career, my identity, my future. I would make the same choice again without hesitation. If I'm gone when you read this, please know that my greatest wish is for you to know each other as brothers. The hatred and division that the Anderson family created stops with you. Forgive each other. Forgive yourselves. And if you can find it in your hearts, forgive me too with all my love. To both my sons. Elizabeth Robert folded the letter carefully, passing it to Daniel. They sat in silence as thunder rumbled outside, each processing the weight of Elizabeth's words and the possibility that they might be her last. Mr. Anderson, Mr. Carter. A nurse approached them. Mrs. Miller is asking for you both before they take her to surgery. They followed the nurse to a small pre-op room where Elizabeth lay connected to various monitors. Her silver hair spread across the pillow, making her look older and more vulnerable than ever. Despite her condition, her eyes were clear and focused when they entered. "My boys," she whispered, managing a weak smile. "Together at last." Robert moved to one side of the bed, Daniel to the other, each taking one of her hands. "Save your strength," Robert urged gently. Elizabeth shook her head slightly. "No more waiting, no more secrets." Her voice was faint but determined. "There's something else you need to know about the accident." Daniel tensed. "Mom, that's in the past. It wasn't just an accident," Elizabeth continued, her gaze fixed on Robert. "James Anderson arranged it." Robert stared at her in shock. "What are you saying?" "When you turned 25, William's original will would have come into effect, revealing your true parentage and granting you control of his personal fortune." Elizabeth's breathing was labored, but she pressed on. "James couldn't let that happen. He hired someone to run you off the road that night." "How do you know this?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible. "Margaret was dating a hospital administrator back then. She overheard James on the phone in your hospital room, arguing with someone about a job gone wrong." Elizabeth's grip tightened on their hands. "When I connected the dots, I knew neither of you would be safe if the truth came out. That's why I sent Michael away, why I disappeared myself." Daniel looked stunned. "So I wasn't responsible for the accident." "You were driving drunk," Elizabeth corrected gently. "That was reckless and wrong, but you weren't the only factor that night. Someone else forced Robert's car into your path." Before either son could respond, Dr. Patel entered with the surgical team. "It's time," he said. "We need to get Mrs. Miller to surgery immediately." Elizabeth squeezed their hands weakly. "Remember your promise," she whispered. "Brothers no matter what," as the medical team wheeled her away, his voice hollow. "While our mother sacrificed everything to protect us both." Robert stopped pacing, his expression hardening with resolve. "I need to see those police reports again. Look for evidence of a second vehicle, and James's personal records from that time. Financial transfers, phone logs, anything that might corroborate Elizabeth's claim. Even if it's true, what does it matter now?" Daniel asked. "James is dead. Elizabeth is fighting for her life. What good does digging into the past do?" "Because the truth matters," Robert replied firmly. "Because Elizabeth deserves vindication after 30 years of silence. And because," he hesitated, "because I need to know if the company I've dedicated my life to was built on an attempted murder." Daniel studied his half-brother's face, recognizing the same determination he'd seen in the mirror during his years plotting revenge against the Andersons. "What do you need from me?" "Access to everything you've gathered on the family. The accident. Anything that might help piece this together." Robert checked his watch. "Elizabeth's surgery will take hours. We might as well use that time productively." Before Daniel could respond, Robert's phone rang. "David." "Dad." His son's voice was tense. "Jennifer's gone, and so are most of her things." "That was expected," Robert replied. "We've reached an agreement. She'll be filing for divorce." "It's not that." David sounded truly disturbed. "Before she left, she accessed your home office. The security system recorded her taking files from the safe. Grandfather's personal records that you inherited." Robert went still. "When?" "About an hour ago." "She left immediately after." David paused. "Dad, she also took Grandfather's gun." "Where are you now?" Robert demanded, suddenly alert. "At your apartment, checking what else might be missing." "Stay there, lock the doors, call security to the apartment immediately." Robert's tone left no room for argument. "And David, be careful. Jennifer is desperate and dangerous right now." After hanging up, Robert turned to Daniel. "Jennifer's taken James's personal records, the very ones that might confirm Elizabeth's story about the accident, and she's armed." "She wouldn't," Daniel began, then stopped himself. "Actually, I think she would. She's cornered, humiliated, about to lose everything she married into." Robert nodded grimly. "And she still has copies of the documents about Elizabeth, about you, about all of it. Even with our agreement, she has nothing to lose by exposing everything now." "What's our next move?" Daniel asked. "You stay here with Elizabeth," Robert decided. "I'm going to the Anderson mansion to find Jennifer and end this, once and for all." "Not alone," Daniel objected. "If Jennifer is as desperate as we think, she's unpredictable. Let me go with you." Robert hesitated, then nodded. "Brothers?" he said quietly, echoing their promise to Elizabeth. "Brothers," Daniel confirmed. They left instructions with the hospital staff to contact them immediately with any changes in Elizabeth's condition, then headed to the parking garage. The storm had intensified further, the downpour reducing visibility to mere feet and flooding side streets. "The Anderson mansion is upstate," Robert explained as they drove. "About an hour north, but longer in this weather. It's where James lived most of his life, where I grew up. It's been mostly empty since his death, maintained by a skeleton staff." "Why would Jennifer go there?" Daniel asked. "Because that's where James kept his most sensitive records, the ones he didn't want found after his death, but couldn't bring himself to destroy." Robert navigated through the flooded streets with grim determination. "I moved them to my apartment for safekeeping after he died, never imagining they might contain evidence of attempted murder." As they drove north through the storm, the parallels to that night 30 years ago were lost on neither man. The torrential rain, the dangerous road conditions, the sense of impending catastrophe. Only this time, they were facing it together, rather than as unwitting adversaries. At the hospital, Elizabeth's surgery was underway, her fragile heart in the hands of the city's best cardiac surgeons. In the gallery above the operating room, Margaret watched with tears in her eyes, praying for her friend to survive long enough to see the reconciliation she'd sacrificed everything for. The Anderson mansion loomed against the stormy sky, its imposing Georgian architecture a dark silhouette against lightning-streaked clouds. Built in the 1920s by the first Anderson Hotel magnate, it had been expanded over generations into a sprawling estate that epitomized old money and power. Robert parked the car at the end of the long driveway, out of sight from the main house. "Jennifer's car is here," he noted grimly, spotting her distinctive red Mercedes near the front entrance. "Let's approach from the east wing. There's a side entrance through the conservatory that's usually unlocked for the gardeners." They made their way through the rain, skirting the manicured grounds now being battered by the storm. The conservatory door was indeed unlocked, allowing them silent entry into the massive home. "The main study is in the west wing," Robert whispered as they moved through darkened hallways. "That's where James kept his private safe, behind a painting of the first Belvedere Hotel." As they approached the central hall, a crash of thunder momentarily drowned out all other sounds. When it faded, they heard something else: papers being shuffled, drawers being opened and closed. Someone was already in the study. Robert motioned for Daniel to follow him, moving carefully toward the partially open study door. Inside, illuminated by a single desk lamp, Jennifer was frantically searching through piles of documents, a gun placed within easy reach on the desk. "Looking for something?" Robert asked calmly, pushing the door fully open. Jennifer spun around, grabbing the gun and pointing it at them in one fluid motion. "Stay back," she warned, her voice unsteady. "Both of you." "Jennifer?" Robert raised his hand slightly, keeping his voice even. "This has gone far enough. Whatever you're looking for, it won't change our agreement." "Agreement?" She laughed bitterly. "You think I'd settle for a payoff when I could have everything? When I know what your precious father did?" "And what exactly did he do?" Robert asked carefully. Trying to gauge how much she knew, Jennifer's smile was cold. "He tried to have you killed rather than let you inherit your real father's fortune. How's that for family values?" She gestured with the gun toward a stack of papers. "It's all here. Payments to a man named Victor Ramirez. Phone logs. Even a letter instructing him to make it look like an accident." Daniel edged slightly to the left, trying to position himself better, but Jennifer swung the gun toward him. "Don't," she warned. "I've got nothing to lose now, thanks to both of you." "What exactly is your plan, Jennifer?" Robert asked, drawing her attention back to him. "Shoot us. Then what?" "Then I take these documents to the board, to the press. The great Robert Anderson built his empire on his father's attempt to murder him, the illegitimate son who wasn't supposed to inherit anything." Her eyes gleamed with malice. "And poor David, the only legitimate Anderson left, will have no choice but to take control with his loving wife by his side. David has already agreed to the divorce," Robert reminded her. "He knows what you've done." "David will do what I tell him once I control the narrative," Jennifer snapped. "He's always been weak. Easily manipulated, just like his father." Lightning flashed, momentarily flooding the room with stark white light, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. In that instant of illumination, a new figure appeared in the doorway behind Jennifer. "David, is that what you really think of me?" he asked quietly. Jennifer whirled, the gun now pointed at her husband. "David," she breathed, "you're not supposed to be here." "Apparently I wasn't supposed to be anywhere but under your thumb," David replied, his voice steady despite the weapon aimed at his chest. "How long have you been planning this, Jennifer?" "Since before we married." "Put the gun down," Robert urged, taking a small step forward. "No one needs to get hurt here." "Stay back," Jennifer's voice rose hysterically. "All of you. I didn't come this far to lose everything now." Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, rain drumming against the windows with almost violent intensity. Inside, 4 people stood frozen in a tableau of betrayal and desperation. "Think about what you're doing," David said, his voice gentle despite the situation. "This isn't you, Jennifer. You have no idea who I am," she replied bitterly. "None of you do." In that moment of distraction, Daniel lunged forward. Grabbing for the gun, Jennifer screamed. The weapon discharged with a deafening report, and both Robert and David shouted in alarm. Daniel staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Jennifer stood frozen in shock, the gun still in her hand, before she could recover. David tackled her from behind, sending them both crashing to the floor. The gun skittered across the hardwood, coming to rest at Robert's feet. "Michael!" Robert rushed to his half-brother's side, using the name their mother had given him. "How bad is it?" "Graze," Daniel gasped through gritted teeth. "Hurts like hell, but I'll live." On the floor, David had pinned Jennifer's arms behind her back. "It's over," he told her firmly. "All of it." Robert retrieved the gun, tucking it safely away before helping Daniel to a chair. "We need to get you to a hospital." "Not until we finish what we came for," Daniel insisted, pressing his hand against the wound. "The documents, are they real?" Robert moved to the desk, quickly scanning the papers Jennifer had been reviewing. His expression darkened as he read. "Yes," he confirmed quietly. "She was telling the truth. James hired someone to run me off the road that night. The payment records, the instructions, it's all here." "So Elizabeth was right," Daniel said, wincing as he shifted in the chair. "All these years she was protecting us from a truth none of us were ready for." Robert gathered the documents, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "David, call the police. And an ambulance for Daniel." "What about her?" David asked, still restraining Jennifer, who had gone unnaturally quiet. "She'll face charges for theft, assault, attempted murder." Robert's voice was cold. "The agreement we made earlier is void. She gets nothing," as David used his free hand to make the calls. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice hollow with defeat. "It wouldn't have worked anyway, would it? Even with all this evidence, the board would have backed you." "The board has nothing to do with family," Robert replied simply. "And that's what this has always been about, though none of us realized it until now." Lightning flashed again, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the mansion. In that moment, Robert's phone rang. The hospital. "Mr. Anderson. Doctor." Patel's voice was grave. "You need to return immediately, Mrs. Miller's condition has deteriorated significantly during surgery, I'm afraid. You should prepare for the worst." Robert's face drained of color. "We're on our way," he said, ending the call and turning to Daniel. "It's Elizabeth. We need to go now." Daniel struggled to his feet, still clutching his wounded shoulder. "How bad?" "Bad?" Robert confirmed grimly. "David, can you handle things here until the police arrive?" David nodded firmly. "Go, both of you. I've got this." As sirens wailed in the distance, Robert and Daniel hurried back to the car, the storm still raging around them. The documents that proved James Anderson's treachery were secured in Robert's briefcase, but they seemed insignificant now, compared to the possibility of losing Elizabeth just when they'd found her, and each other. "Hold on, Mom," Daniel whispered as they sped back toward the city. "Just hold on, your sons are coming." The storm showed no signs of abating. As Robert's car tore through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, Daniel sat tensely in the passenger seat, his makeshift bandage already soaked through with blood from the gunshot wound. Neither spoke, both consumed by the same fear, that they might be too late. "You should let me drop you at the emergency room," Robert said, breaking the silence as they approached Columbia Presbyterian. "That shoulder needs proper treatment." "Not until I see her," Daniel replied through gritted teeth. "I've already lost 30 years, I won't lose another minute." Robert nodded, understanding completely. The brotherly connection that had seemed impossible just days ago now felt as natural as breathing. Elizabeth's final gift to them both, recognition of the blood they shared. They pulled into the hospital's circular drive, abandoning the car at the entrance. Inside, they rushed past the reception desk toward the cardiac surgical unit, Robert's name and reputation clearing their path without questions. Margaret met them in the surgical waiting area, her face grave. "She's still in surgery? There were complications?" Her heart stopped twice on the table. Daniel swayed slightly, the combination of blood loss and emotional exhaustion taking its toll. Robert steadied him with a firm hand. "You need medical attention," he insisted. "Not yet," Daniel repeated stubbornly. Dr. Patel emerged from the surgical suite, his scrubs spattered with blood. Elizabeth's blood. He removed his mask, his expression making words almost unnecessary. "We've done everything possible," he said quietly. "The damage to her heart was too extensive, the strain of surgery too great for someone her age. We've placed her on bypass temporarily. But," he shook his head, "I'm sorry. We're only prolonging the inevitable at this point." "How long?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible. "Hours at most." Dr. Patel's professional detachment slipped, revealing genuine compassion. "We're moving her to a private room where you can be with her. She's sedated but may regain consciousness briefly." "Thank you," Robert said, "for everything you've tried to do." As Dr. Patel turned to leave, he noticed Daniel's blood-soaked shirt. "Sir, you need immediate medical attention. That wound—" "It can wait," Daniel interrupted. "No, it can't," Robert countered firmly. "Elizabeth would never forgive me if I let you bleed out while sitting at her bedside." He turned to the doctor. "Can you have someone treat him near Elizabeth's room? I give you my word he won't leave the hospital without proper care." Dr. Patel nodded. "I'll arrange it immediately." Within 30 minutes, Daniel's wound had been cleaned, stitched, and bandaged. The bullet had indeed only grazed him, tearing through muscle but missing bone and major blood vessels. With his arm in a sling and pain medication dulling the worst of the discomfort, he joined Robert in Elizabeth's private room. She lay still and pale, connected to a maze of tubes and wires, each machine telling its own part of the story of a heart that was failing. Her silver hair had been tucked under a surgical cap, making her look somehow smaller, more vulnerable. Robert and Daniel took positions on either side of her bed, each gently holding one of her hands. Margaret stood at the foot, tears streaming silently down her face. "I should have known," Robert said quietly. "All these years, working in my hotel, watching over me from a distance, some part of me must have recognized her." "She didn't want to be recognized," Margaret replied softly. "She wanted to be near you. That's all. It was enough for her." Daniel stroked his mother's hand, his throat tight with emotion. "I wasted so many years on hatred when I could have been looking for her, for you," he said to Robert. "If I had known the truth—" "She protected us both," Robert said. "From James, from the truth. From each other when that truth would have destroyed us." He reached across the bed, offering his free hand to Daniel. "Now it's our turn to protect her legacy." Daniel clasped his brother's hand firmly. Outside, lightning illuminated the room, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the hospital walls. The storm that had begun the night of the accident 30 years ago was finally breaking. Elizabeth's eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, she seemed disoriented. Then her gaze focused on her sons, one on each side of her bed. Their hands joined across her. "My boys," she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. "Together. We're here, Mom," Daniel said, leaning closer. "Both of us," Robert added, "just like we promised." A faint smile touched Elizabeth's lips. "The medallion," she whispered to Robert. "You found the note." "I did," he confirmed. "I've worn it my whole life without knowing. Your father wanted you to have it." Her gaze shifted to Daniel. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her quickly. "Just a scratch." Elizabeth's eyes moved between them questioningly. "Jennifer," Robert explained simply. "She found James's records about the accident, confronted us with a gun." He squeezed her hand gently. "You were right, Elizabeth. James did arrange it. We have proof now." "I never wanted you to know," she whispered. "Such a terrible burden. No more terrible than the one you've carried all these years," Robert said softly. Elizabeth's breathing became more labored, each word clearly requiring tremendous effort. "Michael," she said, using his birth name, "Forgive yourself the accident. Not entirely your fault." "I know, Mom," Daniel replied, tears falling freely now. "I understand now." She turned to Robert. "Your father, William, would be so proud, the man you've become. Because of you," Robert said, his voice breaking. "You saved my life twice. Once when you brought me into this world, and again that night in the operating room." Elizabeth's eyes drifted closed briefly, then opened with visible effort. "Listen," she said, her voice growing fainter. "The hospital, Anderson Miller Cardiac Center, James's money, put it to good use." "I will," Robert promised. "In your name, in your honor. Not just my name," Elizabeth insisted weakly. "Both of you, brothers. My legacy." The monitors around her bed began to change their rhythm, numbers dropping as alarms softly chimed. A nurse appeared in the doorway, but Margaret intercepted her, whispering something that made the nurse nod and step back, giving the family these final precious moments together. "One last thing," Elizabeth whispered, her voice now so faint they had to lean in to hear her. "The wooden box, behind the baseboard, Robert's birth certificate, photographs for both of you. We'll find it," Daniel assured her. "We'll keep everything." Elizabeth's gaze moved between her sons one last time, a lifetime of love and sacrifice reflected in her tired eyes. "My greatest joy," she murmured, "seeing you together, brothers." Her eyes drifted closed again, her breathing becoming more shallow. Robert and Daniel maintained their positions, one on each side, hands still joined across her bed, creating a circle of family that had taken 30 years to complete. Outside, the storm began to subside, the space between lightning and thunder growing longer, the rain softening from violent downpour to gentle shower. Inside, in the quiet of the hospital room, Elizabeth Miller took her final breath, surrounded by the two sons she had loved in such different ways, one from painfully enforced distance, one from complicated closeness, but both with the fierce, protective devotion only a mother could feel. The monitors registered the change immediately, their alarms more insistent now. The medical team entered, but it was a formality. Elizabeth was gone, her scarred hand still caught between the clasped hands of her sons, the final bridge connecting them even in death. Hours later, as dawn broke over a rain-washed Manhattan, Robert and Daniel sat in the hospital's small chapel. Neither was particularly religious, but both felt the need for quiet reflection. The doctor had finally convinced Daniel to accept IV antibiotics and additional treatment for his wound, and Robert had made the necessary arrangements for Elizabeth's care. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. "We honor her wishes," Robert replied simply. "The Anderson Miller Cardiac Center, her apartment, the wooden box." He turned to face his half-brother. "And we figure out what it means to be brothers after a lifetime of being strangers." "And the company?" Daniel asked. "After all this, James's betrayal, Jennifer's schemes, can you still lead it?" Robert considered the question carefully. "The company isn't James's legacy anymore. It's mine. What I've built from what he left." He paused, studying Daniel's face. "And perhaps, if you're willing, it could be yours too." Daniel looked surprised. After everything that's happened, after I infiltrated your company seeking revenge, because of everything that's happened, Robert corrected. You have the expertise, the experience. More importantly, your family, the only blood relative I have besides David. He offered a small smile. Elizabeth would like it, I think, her sons working together instead of against each other. Before Daniel could respond, Robert's phone buzzed with a text from David. Jennifer in custody. Police have documents. Need to talk when you can. Reality intrudes. Robert sighed, showing Daniel the message. There will be questions, investigations, the truth about James, about the accident, possibly about all of us. Are you prepared for that? Daniel asked. For people to know you're not James Anderson's biological son. I'm Elizabeth Miller's son, Robert said firmly, and William Anderson's. After nearly losing my life because James couldn't accept that, I think I'm finally ready to embrace it. He stood, straightening his suit jacket with unconscious precision. The question is, are you ready to be Michael Miller again? To reclaim the identity you abandoned 30 years ago? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he finally admitted. I've been Daniel Carter longer than I was ever Michael Miller. But perhaps I could be both. Daniel Michael Miller Carter, Robert suggested with the hint of a smile. Quite a mouthful for business cards. It was the first moment of levity they'd shared, brief but genuine, a beginning. Perhaps, of the brotherly relationship Elizabeth had wished for them. As they left the chapel, morning sunlight was breaking through the clouds, glinting off puddles and rain-streaked windows. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean, ready for whatever came next, in Elizabeth Miller's modest apartment later that day. Robert and Daniel found the loose baseboard exactly where she had described it. The wooden box inside contained the artifacts of a life split in two. Her life before the accident and after. Medical school diplomas, surgical awards, photographs of a young Elizabeth with a handsome dark-haired man who was unmistakably William Anderson. And buried beneath these treasures, a birth certificate for Robert William Anderson, listing Elizabeth Miller and William Anderson as his parents. She kept everything, Daniel said softly, lifting a photograph of himself as a teenager receiving his high school diploma, Elizabeth beaming proudly beside him. Every moment, every memory. Both her lives, Robert agreed, examining a faded picture of Elizabeth holding a newborn, himself, with William Anderson standing protectively beside them, the one she lost and the one she built from its ashes. Among the papers was a sealed envelope addressed to my sons. Inside was a document neither had expected, Elizabeth's will, professionally prepared and notarized just months earlier. She knew this day might come, Daniel realized as they read it together. She was preparing for it. The will was simple and direct. Her modest savings and pension were to be divided equally between Robert and Daniel, her medical books and journals to Columbia Presbyterian's medical library, her personal effects to be shared between her sons as they saw fit. But the final paragraph held the true heart of her wishes. It is my fervent hope that my sons, Robert and Michael, will find their way to each other through the truth I was never brave enough to tell them in life. The greatest legacy I could leave is not material possessions, but the bond of brotherhood between them, a bond of blood that transcends the mistakes and secrets of the past. Robert carefully returned the will to its envelope. She thought of everything, didn't she? Even how to bring us together if she couldn't do it herself. That was our mother, Daniel said, a catch in his voice. Always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. They spent hours in the apartment, going through the box, learning about the woman who had given them life in such different circumstances. The brilliant young medical student who had fallen in love with a married man, the dedicated surgeon who had secretly operated on her own son without revealing her identity, the broken-hearted mother who had sent one son away to protect him from the consequences of nearly killing his half-brother, the humble housekeeper who had cleaned hotel rooms just to be near the son she had been forced to give up. As evening fell, they carefully repacked the wooden box with its precious contents. This was just the beginning of their exploration of Elizabeth's life, of their shared history, of what it meant to be brothers after decades of separation and secrets. I keep thinking about what she said at the end, Robert mused as they prepared to leave, about being her legacy, both of us. Together, I spent 30 years plotting against your family, Daniel reminded him. Against you, though I didn't know it. That's not exactly a foundation for brotherhood. No, Robert agreed. But the next 30 years might be if you're willing to try. Outside Elizabeth's apartment building, their cars waited side by side, Robert's sleek luxury sedan and Daniel's more modest vehicle. 2 different lives, 2 different paths, now unexpectedly converged. The Anderson Miller Cardiac Center, Daniel said thoughtfully. She had it all planned out, didn't she? Down to the name, Robert agreed with a sad smile. Making sure we'd have to work together, at least on that. She always was the smartest person in any room, Daniel said, as they prepared to go their separate ways. Robert to deal with the aftermath at the Anderson mansion. Daniel to his hotel suite to process everything that had happened. Robert hesitated, then removed the St. Luke medallion from around his neck. You should have this, he said, holding it out to Daniel. You're her son too. She would want us to share her legacy. Daniel looked at the medallion, the physical link that had connected Elizabeth to Robert through decades of separation, then gently closed Robert's fingers back around it. Keep it, he said. You've worn it your whole life. Besides, he added with the ghost of a smile, I have a feeling we'll be seeing plenty of each other from now on, brothers, remember? Brothers, Robert confirmed, returning the medallion to its place around his neck as their cars pulled away in opposite directions. Neither man could have known that across town, in the offices of the New York Times, an anonymous package had just arrived containing copies of James Anderson's incriminating documents about the accident 30 years ago. Nor could they have guessed that in the early hours of the morning, Jennifer Anderson had made a deal with prosecutors, trading information about the Anderson family's secrets for leniency in her own case. The storm had passed, but the ripples of truth it had uncovered were just beginning to spread, reaching toward a shore neither brother could yet see clearly, in the cardiac intensive care unit at Columbia Presbyterian. Now quiet and empty of Elizabeth's presence, Margaret Jenkins stood at the window watching the sun set over Manhattan. You did it, Liz, she whispered to her absent friend. Your boys found each other. They found you. Rest easy now. And somewhere, perhaps, Elizabeth Miller finally did, 1 year later. Sunshine bathed the front entrance of Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, where a crowd had gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the Anderson Miller Cardiac Center. The building gleamed with glass and steel, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the older hospital wings surrounding it. Robert Anderson stood at the podium, immaculate in a tailored suit, addressing the assembled guests. Beside him stood Daniel Miller Carter, who had officially reclaimed part of his birth name, while keeping the identity he'd built over 30 years. The brothers made a striking pair, similar in height and bearing, different in style, united by blood only recently acknowledged. Today marks not just the opening of a medical facility, Robert was saying, but the fulfillment of a promise to a woman who spent her life healing others, often at great personal cost. The crowd included hospital staff, donors, press, and a mix of people whose lives had been touched by Elizabeth Miller, former patients, colleagues from her surgical days, and housekeeping staff from the Belvedere Hotel who had requested the day off to attend. The Anderson Miller Cardiac Center will provide cutting-edge cardiac care to patients regardless of their ability to pay, Robert continued. It will train the next generation of cardiac surgeons, and it will stand as a testament to the woman who taught me, who taught all of us, that legacy isn't measured in buildings or bank accounts, but in lives touched and hearts healed. In the front row, Margaret Jenkins dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her sat David Anderson, now actively involved in the charitable foundation that would help fund the center's work with underprivileged patients. His divorce from Jennifer had been finalized months ago, and the scandal that had threatened to engulf the Anderson family had been carefully managed, not buried or denied, but addressed with a transparency that had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the company. I never had the privilege of knowing Dr. Elizabeth Miller during her groundbreaking surgical career, Robert said, his voice softening. I knew her instead as a woman of quiet dignity who cleaned hotel rooms with the same precision and care she once used in the operating room. He paused, emotion briefly overtaking him. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that she was watching over all of us, in ways we could never have imagined. He gestured to Daniel, who stepped forward. My brother and I stand before you today, As Elizabeth Miller's true legacy, Daniel continued, 2 sons who spent decades apart, now united in honoring the woman who gave us both life, in very different circumstances. The story of Elizabeth Miller and her sons had become something of a legend in New York medical circles over the past year. The brilliant surgeon who had secretly operated on her own son, who had given up her career to protect both her children, who had worked as a hotel maid for 15 years, just to be near the son she had been forced to give up for adoption. The press had initially sensationalized aspects of the story, but the dignity with which Robert and Daniel had handled the revelations had quickly transformed it into something more nuanced, a human drama of sacrifice, redemption, and family. In this center, Daniel went on, patients will find not just medical expertise, but compassion. The kind of compassion that drove Elizabeth Miller to work 12 hours straight to save a life, even when her own hand was injured. He unconsciously touched his shoulder, where the bullet wound from Jennifer's gun had healed, leaving its own scar. The kind of compassion that sees beyond status or circumstance to the human being in need. As Daniel spoke, Robert's gaze drifted to the simple bronze plaque being unveiled today. It featured a relief sculpture of Elizabeth in her surgical scrubs, her distinctive half-moon scar visible on her right hand as she reached toward a stylized heart. Below the image were the words, Dr. Elizabeth Miller, 1945 to 2024. Surgeon, healer, mother, the truth will set you free. When it came time to cut the ribbon, Robert and Daniel did it together. Their hands joined on the ceremonial scissors. The crowd applauded as photographers captured the moment for posterity. 2 brothers, once strangers, now partners in preserving their mother's legacy. After the ceremony, at the reception inside the new center's airy atrium, Robert found himself beside Marta, the housekeeper who had been Elizabeth's closest colleague at the Belvedere. She would be so proud, Marta said, gesturing around the space. Of this place, but mostly of you 2, together. I hope so, Robert replied. I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd discovered the truth while she was still alive. If we could have had time together, the 3 of us, as a family. She had time with you every day, Marta said wisely. Each room she cleaned, each time she saw you in the hallway or lobby, those moments were precious to her. She told me once that seeing you succeed was enough for her, but it wasn't enough for me, Robert said quietly. I would have wanted to know her, really know her. You do know her, Marta insisted. This center, what you and your brother have built together, that is knowing her, that is honoring her. Across the room, Daniel was deep in conversation with Dr. Patel, who had been Elizabeth's surgeon during her final hours. The past year had been one of transformation for Daniel. After 3 decades as a financial executive, he had made a dramatic career change, entering medical school at 51. Some might call it a midlife crisis, he told Robert when announcing his decision. I call it coming full circle, following in our mother's footsteps, the way I was always meant to. With his business background and Robert's support, Daniel had also taken on a significant role in restructuring the Anderson Hotel Group's charitable foundation, now renamed the Elizabeth Miller Foundation. The foundation focused on medical scholarships for underprivileged students and support for healthcare workers facing financial hardship, causes Elizabeth would have championed. Robert made his way to the display case near the center's main entrance. Inside, protected behind glass, lay items from Elizabeth's wooden box, her medical school diploma, surgical awards, photographs of her with both her sons at different stages of their lives, and at the center, a restored Patek Philippe watch, the same one Jennifer had stolen, now transformed from a symbol of division into one of unity. She kept everything, didn't she? David said, joining his father at the display. Every memory, every connection, even when she couldn't acknowledge them openly, Robert agreed. That was her gift. Loving from a distance when circumstances demanded it. Their relationship had deepened over the past year as well. The revelations about Robert's parentage had initially shaken David, making him question his place in the family. But Robert had been steadfast in his assurance that being a father was about more than biology. It was about choice, about love, about presence. The same lessons Elizabeth had taught through her own complicated journey of motherhood. I've been thinking about Jennifer, David said carefully. Her sentencing is next week. Robert nodded. The legal proceedings against Jennifer Anderson had moved at the deliberate pace of the justice system. She had eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges of theft and reckless endangerment, avoiding the more serious attempted murder charge in exchange for her testimony against some of Vincent Moretti's associates. "Will you attend?" Robert asked. David shook his head. "No, that chapter is closed for me, but I did want to ask." He hesitated. "The foundation money you set aside for her legal representation. I appreciate that, Dad. You didn't have to do that. Family is complicated," Robert said simply. "Even the parts we'd rather forget." The conversation was interrupted as Daniel approached, now wearing the white coat of a medical student over his suit. "They're waiting for us in the pediatric ward," he reminded them. "The children want to meet the hospital builders." As they walked together through the gleaming corridors of the new center, Robert was struck by how much had changed in a year. The Anderson Hotel Group had weathered the storm of revelations about James's attempt on Robert's life, emerging stronger for its transparency. The board had unanimously supported Robert's continued leadership. Impressed by his handling of the crisis, the family's story had even inspired a documentary film, currently in production, focusing on Elizabeth's extraordinary life and the medical advances she had pioneered before her abrupt departure from the profession. Margaret Jenkins had served as a consultant, ensuring that Elizabeth's contributions to cardiac surgery were accurately portrayed and properly credited. In the pediatric cardiac ward, cheerful murals brightened walls that housed the most advanced medical technology available. Children in various stages of treatment gathered in the playroom, their faces lighting up as Robert, Daniel, and David entered. "Are you really brothers?" asked a small girl with a surgical scar visible above her hospital gown. "My nurse said you didn't know each other until last year." Robert and Daniel exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless communication that had developed between them with surprising speed. "We're brothers," Daniel confirmed, kneeling to the child's level. "Sometimes families find each other in unexpected ways." "Like adoption?" the girl asked. "My little brother is adopted." "Something like that," Robert said, joining them. "The important thing isn't how you become family, but that you are family, and that you're stuck with each other forever," David added with a smile, making the children giggle. Later, as the three men stood on the rooftop helipad overlooking Manhattan, Daniel pulled something from his pocket, the St. Luke medal. "I think she'd want this to be part of the center somehow," he said, handing it to Robert. "A physical link to where it all began." Robert turned the medallion over in his hand, feeling its familiar weight. "I've been thinking," he said, "about starting a new tradition." He opened the small compartment in the back, where Elizabeth's note had been hidden for decades. The paper was gone now, preserved in the display case downstairs, but Robert had replaced it with something new. A tiny photograph of Elizabeth flanked by her two sons, digitally created since no such photo had ever been taken during her lifetime. "This should be passed down," he continued, "to future generations of our family, along with her story, the full story, not just the parts that are comfortable or convenient, the mistakes, the sacrifices, the redemption, all of it. A family heirloom," Daniel nodded, "with Elizabeth at its heart, where she always wanted to be," David added quietly, "with both her sons." As the sun began to set over the city, painting the skyline in hues of gold and amber, the three men stood in companionable silence below them. Doctors, nurses, and staff moved through the halls of the Anderson Miller Cardiac Center, carrying on Elizabeth's work of healing broken hearts. In the main lobby, the Patek Philippe watch in its display case marked the passage of time, not just hours and minutes, but the larger rhythms of loss and discovery, separation and reunion, secrecy and truth. Its steady ticking was a reminder that time moves in only one direction, that the past cannot be changed, only understood and perhaps redeemed. And somewhere, perhaps, Elizabeth Miller looked upon her sons, one raised from afar, one raised up close, now standing side by side, and found peace in the knowledge that her greatest wish had been fulfilled. The cycle of secrets and separation that had defined their lives for 30 years had finally been broken. The truth had, indeed, set them free. The distinctive half-moon scar that had first connected them, visible on Elizabeth's hand as she fought to save Robert's life, recognized by Robert decades later in a hotel lobby, had faded into memory. But the invisible bonds it had helped forge would endure for generations to come, connecting not just two brothers who had found each other against impossible odds, but all those whose lives would be touched by the legacy of a remarkable woman who had understood that some scars mark not just the body, but the soul itself, and that sometimes those scars can finally heal.